Death's a subject that many of us don't like talking or even thinking about, but I've always found it intriguing and interesting, as obviously you do. Firstly, it comes to all of us.
Yeah.
So you would think it would be normal because it's something that has happened to everyone that's ever lived and will happen to us. But I think the thing about it is there's so many unknowns that we just don't know. And I guess the big three are how it's going to happen to us and when it's going to happen and what's on the other side. And the funny thing is no one knows for certain. We all have ideas. But and in your book, one of your books, you wrote about this. I have to confess, I'm an aficionado of death. I'm fascinated by all aspects of death and the dead, and I suppose that's why I'm so fortunate to have landed up in my particular profession. Wherever I've travelled in the world, I've sought out the dead and their stories and looked at how the locals treat them. What about death is so fascinating to you?
Well, I think what you said in the beginning really encapsulates what fascinates me. Death comes to us all, of course, and we are fascinated by it, but people will not talk about their own death. It's almost as though we have this horror of what is to come. We're mesmerized by it. It's almost as though we've got a cobra in front of us and we're looking at it. People don't want to talk about it. What do they say? They don't say, when I die. They say, if something should happen to me. They try and whitewash it as though it isn't actually going to happen. So the psychology behind it has always fascinated me. And the third point you made is a good one too. People wonder what is on the other side. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about that, and that's where all the great religions have come in. What does exist on the other side? It always fascinates me because we are unique amongst all animals as far as we know. We are the only animal that knows that death is coming, and we know that we are mortal. My two Labradors who you saw at home this morning, they have got no idea. They've got no idea they're going to die one day. All they're worried about is the food they're going to get today and going for a walk and lying in front of the fire and sleeping. And for them, it will go on forever. There is no end to this. They are absolutely happy. Whereas we're always sitting there thinking, what's going to happen to me? When will it happen? How will it happen? Why will it happen? And it's, to be quite honest, most people tell you it's a horrible thought when you think I'm not going to be there.
I must admit, I'm probably terrified of getting that diagnosis that you've got a tumour and 3 months to live. So I try and think about that, and I try and think about getting it and my death in order to make it not so terrible when it comes. I don't find it scary. I just trying to ease the shock of that diagnosis, I suppose. I don't know if that's normal or not.
Well, I mean, you're unusual in that you are thinking about it. Most people will not think about it, will not delve into it at all. And it always somewhat amuses me, but it's really part of the psychology. You'll hear two 90-year-olds talking, and they'll say, "Did you hear that Jack died?" And they say, "No, really? Oh my God! But he was only 89." And you think, "Oh, I can't believe this." We all have that sort of reaction. So that's always fascinated me, as well as the mechanisms, the stories of death are just absolutely fascinating, and the way we try and deal with it. And why have I got my job? Why do I try and find out why people die? What is it about our society that we want to do this? In some societies, they won't do autopsies. They don't want to know how people died. What is it about our society that makes us want to know why people die? You have to have it registered on your death certificate. It's fascinating.
The reason for death.
The reason for death. Why did you die? Why do we have to put that on there? What does it matter? I mean, you're dead and that's it. But no, it all has to be documented, and the coroner has to pronounce on it. And we have this tidying away of death. It's to us, it's an important thing. Of course, we're not the only people who have done this. The ancient Egyptians were absolutely engrossed in death. They spent their entire lives building tombs to lie in when they died. And I think it was Julius Caesar who said that they were a disgusting people. They just thought about death all the time, whereas a good Roman knew when to fall on his sword, and death had no fears for them.
So you mentioned that you find it interesting and you study how they deal with death in other parts of the world. What have you found in terms of how we do it versus other cultures?
Well, what was surprising to me is coming to New Zealand first from Africa. In Africa, the dead are not viewed, and when somebody dies, they are removed immediately and nobody sees them again. The coffin comes and you bury them, and that's it. And I was really surprised when I came to New Zealand to find that people actually went and sat with the dead, and they kept the bodies with them for a few days. And I remember I hadn't been here very long, and my neighbour Heck Mason died, and he was laid out in the bed, and we all went round and stood around his bed, and my children looked at him, and I found that fascinating. We didn't do that in Africa. Maybe it's something to do with the heat there, that the bodies.
But I imagined a country like Africa would be very open with bodies. I find that surprising what you say there, and I sort of feel like we're very closed with the body. We don't have the body available for very long.
Yeah,
maybe it's.
Well, the first body I ever saw was when I went to medical school and went into the dissecting hall to start dissecting my first body at the age of 18. And that was the first dead person that I had actually seen. In Africa, they were in the Rhodesian society I grew up in, you just didn't see them. So New Zealand was unusual that way, and I think it is unusual, and I suspect that the Maori influence here has had a huge effect on people here, and we've got a sort of hybrid system here. So New Zealand was different. I'm not sure what happens in Australia. I suspect it's probably more like Africa than it is than New Zealand is. But other parts of the world are quite different, and I write in my books about some of them. The one that really fascinates me is the excarnation, those who leave the bodies out for the vultures to come and eat. And that quite fascinates me. I think it's in Tibet that they have traditionally put the bodies out on the side of the mountain, and the vultures come and take them away. It seems to me to be a very green sort of solution. I mean,
it's just fast tracking what we do, really, isn't it? It's giving it to nature in a few days as opposed to a few months.
Yeah, I found that quite extraordinary. And of course, when I was in Japan, I was fascinated to hear that they actually cremated, but not fully cremated, partly cremated bodies, so that there were bits of bone left. And then they'd have a ceremony where they sit around and with special metal chopsticks, they pick out the bits of bone, starting, I think, with the biggest one, or might be the smallest one, I can't remember which way around it is. And they pass them to each other with the chopsticks and then put it into a jar.
Wow.
And, I found that, it's just so different.
It sounds macabre to us, but I guess it's just culture or normal.
I guess it's just culture, yeah.
So have you, when you're travelling overseas, do you make a conscious point of trying to find out how this is done, or is this as part of your professional career you've come across these?
No, I actually go and look for these things. I look for ossuaries, I look for graveyards. I find out how, what there is about death around the place that's interesting. And that's my one passion. The other passion is battlefields. So I travel around the world. Whenever I travel around the world, I go and see the local battlefields and the local cemeteries, and anything that's unusual about death, I go and look for them. Yeah.
I was telling you, my wife's from Israel, and in Beersheba, there's the town of Beersheba, there's a Commonwealth cemetery with over 1,000 graves, and a large percentage of them are Kiwis. And I never realised in World War One, there was the Kiwis took that town, but they're all still there. Very interesting place to go through.
Yeah, that was Allenby's campaign, which was actually a very exciting one, and it was one of the few places where there was a war of movement right at the end, and it was all quite exciting.
It all happened just on dusk one evening in just space of a few hours.
Yeah.
you started off this fascination when you were a young boy, and you tell a story of when you're in Rhodesia, one of your servants' sons who died,
Yeah.
and the father buried a lot of clothing. And
Yeah.
then you,
Yeah, no, it was Rhodesia was an interesting place in that, of course, being in the center of Africa in a colonial type setup, we had servants and they lived on site. And in the early days, they used to have their families living with them. And my early playmates were the children of our black servants. And I remember our cook's name was Robert, and his wife was Sama, and they had a little girl called Tombi, which is also the name of my Labrador at home. Um, and Tombi actually means black girl. It's sort of an affectionate term for them. Tombi was my great playmate, and the mother fell pregnant and had a young boy, a little boy, and he died probably within a week or two of delivery. Didn't know what. I was probably about 6, 7 years old. And the police were called and came, collected the body. Again, everything has to be done in a documented way, and the death certificate filled out. And I was told I wasn't allowed to go to the servants' quarters. So of course I was onto my bicycle and down there as fast as I could go to see what was happening. And Robert was there burning blankets and burning clothing. And I went and stood next to him and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, that there'd been a spell put on his child and he had to burn the cloth to get rid of it. And, as a young boy in Africa, took that. That was fine. And he buried them.
Did you believe it about the spell?
I did not believe it. I mean, when you're a young child, you believe what people tell you, and that's what he said. And maybe it's his explanation for an infection or whatever, I don't know, but that's what he said. And he buried it all there. And I remember going away and thinking about it and thinking, I wonder what this looks like. So I went back on my bicycle and I dug it all up carefully and examined all the pieces. And I always think maybe that was the makings of a pathologist.
That's a very odd thing for an 8-year-old boy to do,
yeah,
I would think.
Yeah, no, it was very weird.
What did you find?
Oh, just bits of, I remember it was a red blanket, charred blanket and so on. I just went through them all and looked at them. And no, there was, I didn't find a cause of death there, but I didn't find a spell either.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting, really quite deep quotes in your books, which I found really intriguing and full of meaning. So I just want to read a few of those during the interview. But one of them, talking about your career as a pathologist, people say, "So I hear you're a pathologist. People often look at me uneasily as they say this. Perhaps they sense that through me, the horsemen of the apocalypse are already circling them. They're right, but those deathly horses have nothing to do with me. They're always there, continually circling us all. I'm only there to help pick up the pieces after they've visited," which I thought was very true, quite beautiful.
Yeah.
So we've just been having a look around your workplace here in the hospital, which was fantastic. Thank you. It's interesting, even though most of your job, I think you said 80% or more, is the study of living tissue or from living people. Everyone characterizes or thinks of a pathologist as someone who works with the dead.
Yeah, no, that's right.
I guess that's because it's more interesting to us. Dead and the unknown.
I think so, yeah. I find at dinner parties with non-pathologists, they all want to talk about death and mainly murder, actually. Nobody is interested in the fascinating diseases and the fascinating cures we get and the strange things that happen to the living people. Nobody's terribly interested in that. You're only interested in that if it's your personal biopsy. Then you want to know what that shows. So I think it's part of this, this fascination that we have with death. People always look at me when I say I'm a pathologist, and you can see what they're thinking. More so now they know what we do because they've seen CSI, they've seen programs about what pathologists do, and it is more widely known. But certainly back in the 80s, if you said you're a pathologist, people thought that you looked at rotting bodies that had been dredged out of a river. They'd been lying for the last 6 weeks, and they thought that's what you did all day. And, they had no idea about anything else. So the whole diagnostic component to our work, well, you've seen it now going through our laboratory. It's immense, and it's absolutely fascinating.
It's essentially detective work, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, I was surprised this morning because a lot of it is automated, and I had no idea it was also automated. But you were saying a lot of the tissue sampling and studying is still carried out by people, or a pathologist, which...
Particularly, most of the work is they're ill or they've got a problem and nobody knows what it is. And our phone goes all the time with surgeons and physicians and all sorts of medical people phoning up to say, patient so-and-so, have you looked at their liver? What's going on? Let me tell you about the patient. And so we spend all day. People say pathologists are there. You'd miss the patient contact. We talk to people all day about really interesting things, interesting diagnoses, even interesting things like rashes. I mean, people think a rash is not very interesting. I do a lot of those. And of course, at the other end is a patient who's scratching away furiously, and they want to know what it is. And I get phone calls all the time asking about, could it be this or could it be that, or should I be doing this or should I be doing that? So it's really it's a great detective game.
And the interesting thing about that, I was telling you, I'm an aircraft engineer and a pilot, and find air accidents and crashes very interesting, as you've said you do. But the thing about that is you don't, before the accident happened, you don't have the knowledge of hindsight. So you have no idea why this happened. But once you've looked into it and found out the answers, it seems so obvious. Well, he crashed because he didn't put the flaps down. Why did we never realise that? But before, it's not obvious. And I was thinking that your job is probably quite similar to that. Now, some of these rare diseases and things, or ones that you might have seen and forgotten about, are probably similar to that. Why didn't I think of that before? But you don't have that knowledge of hindsight.
No, that's absolutely right. These things become very clear. I have a patient who had a really fascinating story of years of going to see general practitioners with problems that didn't make any sense, and it was labeled as neuropsychiatric and all sorts of issues, and went to see lots of different specialists about one thing and another. And it was interesting that at the end of the day, she had a biopsy done, and one of our pathologists spotted that she had this rare disease called amyloidosis, which is a deposit that gets into your tissues and your blood vessels and causes a whole variety of really weird symptoms. And when you went back through her notes, you found that all the specialists there in their various fields had all the symptoms, everything that you needed to make the diagnosis. But for instance, she saw an ENT surgeon, and he looked at her and said, oh, you've got a very big tongue, but I can't see anything wrong here. The big tongue is classical of amyloid. And when you put them all together into one place, there it was. And it's so obvious in hindsight. And for years and years, everybody just looked and said, oh, I don't know. It doesn't make any sense at all. And of course, hindsight's always precise, isn't it? It's always very obvious.
There was an interesting case that you wrote about where you were called to a house where a body had been discovered in a locked room, but the house was extremely tidy and had a lot of unopened presents all through it. And there was no evidence of a break-in. The door was locked from the inside, and you had... But where the body was found looked like all hell had broken loose. But there was nothing obvious as to how this happened.
Yeah, it was a strange one. It was the middle of the night, and the CIB phoned me up. It was pouring with rain. And eventually I found this house, and we had to wait outside while they got a locksmith to come out. I think we waited outside in the rain for about an hour. And it really was quite fascinating. And he had his car there, which I think was a Vauxhall, an old car. And in it were his driver's gloves, one on top of the other on top of the dashboard. And then there was a box with maps, one for each town. And everything was meticulous. And when you got into the house, everything was like that too. There were all his childhood toys still in their boxes, some of them with their original wrappers, sitting on tables and on the mantelpiece and so on. I thought, this is very weird. And then locked in the bedroom was the gentleman dead in his pajamas with blood everywhere, blood on the ceiling, footprints halfway up the wall, handprints everywhere.
Wow.
Bed trashed. The whole room was trashed. And he was lying on the floor with the mattress on top of him. And it looked just like a most terrible assault.
Was that your first thought? This is a shocking murder?
Well, that's what the CIB thought. But he was locked in this room. It was locked from the inside. It was a hell of a job to get in there. There was no way in or out. And this made no sense at all. And eventually they did the autopsy, took him along to the mortuary that night, and all the CIB are there. And all the blood came from a cut on his finger and a cut on his big toe, which, as you know, they both can bleed horrifically. That's all there was. And otherwise there was nothing to find. Not a single cause of death. But ultimately the explanation came out, and it was a real surprise when it did. The patient was under the care of the psychiatrists, and he had been started on one type of psychiatric medicine and changed to another, and he had unusual levels of both, and they can cause this syndrome called malignant neuroleptic syndrome, where they develop an acute psychosis and a terror, and they attack things, and they can develop very high body temperatures and drop dead. And we're pretty sure that that was the explanation. Everything seemed to fit there. But it was really quite bizarre. The funny side of that was the reason why he was found at midnight was there was a con man working the area. And what this man was doing, he was going to different houses, and he'd knock on the door and he'd say, "Oh, I'm Bill from next door. My daughter in Wanganui's had a car accident and I need to get over there, but I haven't got any petrol. Can you lend me $10? And, people just hand over $10. They don't think there isn't actually a Bill next door. So he was doing that scam.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody answered the door, heard this out, and said, "No, you're not. You don't live next door to me." And phoned the police.
Right.
And they came to pick him up, which they did. And the policeman was then sent to go and find out from different houses, did he come to you? Did you give him any money? So that they could get the charge sheet going. Knocked on the door of this house, no answer. Saw the lights were on, thought that's odd. Went round the back and looked through the bedroom window and saw this guy lying on the floor and he raised the alarm.
So he could have been lying there for days or weeks.
He could have been there for goodness knows how long.
Mm.
But as it turned out, it was minutes or hours afterwards. The funny thing was that the con man was taken down to the station and told that, the police, this was a homicide investigation. And, so he confessed everything, of course, because,
he could see a murder charge
he could
coming.
see there was big trouble. And, they said, "You better tell us what you did because, there's a man dead in there.
Mm.
And, we reckon that you're the key to this. And, you can consider yourself under arrest." And he confessed everything, but not that.
So you wrote a couple of interesting things about that story, which I've noted down. Here we go again, I thought. This is going to be about psychiatry. I was good at recognising the signs and causes of death, but I couldn't begin to fathom the kinds of behaviour in a life like this. I couldn't understand what was going on. If I couldn't understand what was going on in his life, how was I supposed to find the truth about his death? I knew I needed to understand his story. And I think that's what I found great about your books, is that you've really included a lot of the backstories of people and their lives, and it's not just some cold hard facts about how they died.
No, that's right. One of my pathology teachers when I was a medical student is Kevin Lee, who I've written about I mentioned him a couple of times in two of my books. Kevin Lee always used to say, and he was talking about crime scenes generally, put yourself in the mind of the victim.
Mm-hmm.
What would they have done? Put yourself in the mind of the murderer and say, why did they do this? What would you have done next? And that will help you work out what happened at the scene. Don't just go there and say, oh yeah, this looks interesting. You've got to actually think, what were they thinking? What do they do? And I've done this all my life whenever I look at a scene or get involved in any of these things. What are they thinking? What were they doing when this happened? Why did they end up where they are? What happened to them? And what were their thought processes? So to my mind, that's the important part. Unfortunately, I know so little about psychiatry.
Well, you probably learnt a bit over the years. But in this case, it's not the murderer, it's the victim, because there was no murderer. And what I found interesting reading the stories in your books is that so often it seems you're doing the job of the police. You know, what happened here, even though you've just essentially come to examine the body, you're the one that's putting yourself in their position, and how could all of this come to play, or at least you're assisting the police.
Yeah, it's. I think pathology's changed quite a bit since I was trained and practiced. In my day, the pathologist was, if not the first, amongst the first on the scene to see the body, because you have to interpret the injuries or whatever you find in the context of the whole scene. Now that's changed. I think pathologists still go to the scene, but there is an increasing belief amongst the newer generation of forensic pathologists that perhaps you should just have the body brought to the mortuary and not be biased in any way. Otherwise you get cognitive bias on what to expect, and that influences what you're going to see. I'm not sure I agree with that. So I have always been brought up with you go in there with the police, you're part of the investigation team, you're part of the first people on the scene. That's changed too. Of course, DNA changed that too. The first person on the scene has to be the scientist collecting all the DNA now. That's changed everything, of course.
Do pathologists still go to the scenes these days?
I think they do. I don't think it's quite with the same philosophy, if you like, that we had in my day. And I certainly always saw myself as part of the investigation team. The police always told me what their findings were, and in homicide cases we'd always get briefings about exactly where we've got to and what's happening and so on, which I found quite interesting.
You've written 3 books.
Yes.
The Cause of Death, The Quick and the Dead, and just recently The Final Diagnosis. Yes. I bought them all. I read them all.
Oh, good.
Great reads. What was the motive to write these stories and stories of people and your career?
Well, I've always enjoyed writing. My career really started when I was 13. So writing has always been, and writing stories has always been something that has interested me as a hobby. And I thought several years ago, what I'm going to do is start writing my memoirs, but I won't do it in the sense of a time scale. I'll do it in the sense of, let's just take the interesting cases and write about them and what happened and what my recollection of them is. And fortunately, I've kept notes and have access to all the files of my cases and the cases we've done here. So I started writing just individual stories, put them all together.
To be a memoir,
to be a
so
memoir.
Much a book. Yeah.
Really, I was just writing my memoirs. I wasn't writing it to write a book to sell. It was just my memoirs. And the 3 books constitute my memoirs, the stories that I can tell. There are stories I can't tell, of course, because for a variety of reasons, which I shouldn't really go into. But these are all the interesting cases that I've been involved with over the years.
So it's not something you always plan to do, or is it more of a recent idea?
Well, as I say, I've always written. I think writers tend to do it as a hobby. You know, it's the same as people might play golf or do other things. And even now, although I'm not writing any books, I still keep writing. It's just one of the things that helps you relax. So no, it wasn't intended to be anything other than my memoirs.
Is there any more coming?
No, there are only the cases that I can't talk about now, which I can tell you about offline, but I can't really talk about them publicly. No, I'm not doing that. But what I am writing about now is my story and experiences of going through medical school in Africa.
Wow,
and I'm doing that really as a memoir too. My training was in Africa, and it was in a hospital which looked after black people, and it was just absolutely fascinating.
And this was in the 60s?
In the 70s.
70s.
And this was in Rhodesia, in Salisbury. And I remember we had a locum surgeon came to work with us for a while. He was retired in the UK. His name was Bernard Williams, and he'd been very famous in the desert during the war for setting up the first operating theatres. Bernard Williams came to work for us, and I was his house surgeon, and it was the first night on call. And I phoned him up, and I said, I've got 2 cases for tonight. And he said, oh, what are they? And I said, well, the first one's a man who's been shot with a bow and arrow, and the arrow's stuck in his back. And he said, oh, good God. He said, I've never seen one of those. And I said, the second one's a man who's been trampled by a rhinoceros. And he said, this is not England, that's for sure. And Africa was like that. They were always fascinating cases.
Well, so that's going to be published?
Well, I haven't intended to. I'm just writing them. We'll see what happens. See what it looks like.
I think it would be a good idea.
Yeah, the stories from Africa are just unbelievable. They really are.
Yeah. And the proceeds of all your books go to the Grassroots Trust, Helicopter Trust.
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, I didn't write to make money. I mean, I am a pathologist, and as all writers will tell you, you get paid so little. It's not a very lucrative pastime. But
it's not a retirement income.
It's not a retirement income by any means. In fact, my publisher told me that if you want to make a living from books, you need to have 21 listed books on the market, or else you're not going to do it. And that's just a very average living. So authors out there, beware.
Yeah.
So no, my feeling was that these were my memoirs. I was writing the stories, but I'm really not a writer. I'm a historian, because I write the histories of other people. And I write it using my words, telling the stories that I heard and writing down what I heard other people say. They may not be 100% accurate, but that's my memory of the story. And I thought, well, these stories, they belong to the dead to a great extent, but also to the living patients, because a lot of the stories about people who expected to die but didn't, and their story and what they think about it all. And I thought it was right that the proceeds from that should go to a cause, because they're not my stories. And the rescue helicopter came to mind simply because, as you heard, they take off outside my window about 6 times a day. And like all pilots, I like to stop and watch. Nobody can watch a helicopter take off and land and turn away and go and do something else. Everybody has to watch it.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure they're very appreciative of it.
Yeah.
And I'll just mention here, I was telling you, I booked a motel for the room last night. And when I got here into the room, I looked on Google Maps to see where the hospital was, and it happened to be literally across the road. And then all of a sudden there was a great shaking, and all the trees lay flat, and this bloody helicopter sounded like it was landing in the balcony. And that happened every hour right up till about 11 at night. So your money's going to good use, I'm sure.
Well, probably the proceeds of my book will keep it flying for about half an hour.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it's still appreciated. Can we go back and talk a little bit about your upbringing in Rhodesia?
Yeah, sure.
Which sounds really different and interesting. We spoke about the servant's son who died, and you made an interesting comment about the father, and you said, I saw all the ancient anguish of Africa in that look. What did you mean by those words, the ancient anguish of Africa?
You know, we live in a very lucky country, and people here talk about poverty and they talk about the disadvantaged and so on, but they haven't seen the half of it. People in Africa, there are people who don't have enough food, people who die of preventable diseases. The poverty is quite extreme. And yet, you know, they are so happy. All their lives and all their ancestors' lives have been really hard and full of suffering and so on. And yet they sing and they dance all the time. But they seem inured to a hardship. They carry it in a way that I think would probably break other people. I've always been amazed how tough they are.
Do you think they know this hardship? Do they know any other way? They probably don't.
Probably not, but I guess, you know, they'll say something like, why else are we born? But to do this. This is my life. This is how it is. And yeah, it's amazing how they deal with it. But they do have a lot of suffering in their lives. And, you know, even working, it's always been difficult. They've had to leave their families on the back in the on their tribal lands, because if you don't occupy your land, you lose the farmland.
Right.
So they'd leave their wives and children there and go into the city to work. And, you know, they'd go in for months at a time and not see their families. We had a gardener, Marunga. No, there was another one. We had a gardener, Mikias Sabili, who came from Malawi, which is about 1,000 miles to the north. And he used to come on a 4-day train trip from Malawi through Mozambique to Rhodesia to work for us as a gardener. And he used to go back home for 2 or 3 months, about once every 4 or 5 years. And those were his, you know, his wife and children were there. And he was always singing, always cheerful, always happy. But they put up with an amazing amount. So that's really what I was referring to, was their resilience to deal with adversity.
And you were brought up, I guess, your teenage and early 20s, right bang in the middle of the Civil War period. Was that right?
Yeah, all through my teenage years and into university, there was the sound of gunfire growing, would probably be the way to put it. Yeah.
So that was mid 60s through to 79, I think that war was.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yes.
It sounds like a pretty tough time.
It was, and again, the resilience of people was amazing. It was an amazing experience for me. I served as a doctor in the Airforce there, and was involved with picking up casualties from the bush, from the battlefront, wherever it was, and civilians who'd driven over landmines and so on. So that was all for a young man, that was all quite exciting. None of us really expected to live beyond the age of 30, I suspect. And
wow.
That's what young people are like.
And that was your first medical job, was it?
Yes, it was.
So you must have seen some horrific injuries.
Oh, yeah. No, it was absolutely unbelievable. I mean, I remember a busload of African civilians driving over a boosted landmine, just 2 landmines, one on the other. And we operated for probably about 18 hours before we had dealt with everybody and got things back into order again. I once had to go, and I write about this, once had to go and pick up 3 or 4 injured, I think they were game rangers. They had landed on a bush strip to carry out a game ranging patrol, and the aeroplane hit a landmine as it touched down on the strip, and the plane, of course, blew up, and ultimately they all died on the way back in the helicopter. So that was quite I was a very young doctor then. That was quite a sobering experience.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was interesting, and Yeah, it was a great experience. I'm
Great.
glad when it was over.
Yeah. What was life like during that period of white minority rule? I don't know a lot about it. Was it an apartheid system?
Not quite. It had very similar. There was a colour bar in the sense that there was not a great admixture of white and black, and the schools were separated into white and black. They were also separated into boys and girls, largely.
Yeah.
So it was of that era. But many things were integrated, like the universities and the medical school that I went to was, we were completely integrated. The armies and police were,
Right.
so it was.
So it's not really an apartheid system at all.
Not quite. It was, I guess, certainly after the war, the goodwill between the different races has persisted. I mean, there have been problems, of course, with the farm seizures and so on. But
and was there quite a bit of mixing of, did you have black friends in the Airforce? And
not really. That, as I say, there was a social colour bar rather than a legal one,
which I think is normal in a lot of societies anyway, isn't it?
It probably would have been not too dissimilar from Australia and New Zealand at the time, or the United States. So that's the way it was. And of course, it's changed over the years.
And what were the medical facilities like in that period? Pretty basic, I assume.
No, they were excellent. In fact, it was remarkable how good they were. I remember we have an orthopedic surgeon here, who's now retired, Richard Lander, who went and did an elective at Harare Hospital, where I'd trained in Salisbury. And he said he was really quite interested. He said it was fully up to the standard of a New Zealand hospital. Wow. Everything was being done in exactly the same way, the same facilities, the same drugs, everything was much the same. It was, quite an advanced system for Africa. And I guess the outreach was pretty good. An excellent obstetric system. Vaccination of kids was across the country for measles was huge. We were virtually eliminating these. So it was sophisticated. Not if you wanted to see really primitive medical facilities, you'd go next door to Mozambique.
Yeah,
that was really primitive. I don't think the Portuguese had developed a great deal there.
You tell a pretty tragic story of a surgery that you and a colleague did on a 3-year-old girl called Precious.
Yeah, no, that really bothers me immensely for a number of reasons.
Still to this day?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you why. In short, Precious was a 3-year-old young African child, and she presented one evening at the hospital with a bowel obstruction. And as the African people did, when they brought their children up to see a doctor, they dressed them beautifully in their best clothes. She was beautifully dressed. I remember these shiny shoes, and it was a beautiful little girl.
Why did they do that?
I think just to show they were good parents,
right.
And showing off, they were proud of her. I mean, They used to bring their babies to well baby clinics, and they'd rub their skin with Vaseline to make them shiny, so that they looked really spot on. It was really quite touching in a way. Anyway, Precious, we came to do surgery on her, and we didn't have an anaesthetist, and we used to use nurse anaesthetists. So they were nurses that we taught to do anaesthetics. They weren't qualified anaesthetists, and a 3-year-old child with a bowel obstruction is not a straightforward case by any means. Anyway, the anaesthetic went forward, and while we were operating, we found the cause. Just Precious had eaten a large amount of sand, and this is a condition called pica, and I think many parents will be familiar with this. They eat sand. The reason is not entirely known. It is thought that it's because of iron deficiency. That's unlikely. Nobody knows quite why this happens. But she'd done this. It had blocked up her bowel. We opened it up and were cleaning all the sand out, and the anaesthetist had run a litre of Ringer's lactate into the child, which was far too much fluid for her size. And the fluid just bubbled up in her lungs, and she got pulmonary edema and died on the table. And, we should have watched it. We should have been watching. We were too busy watching so amazed at this barrel full of sand. We lost the plot. And as a pilot, you'll know that happens sometimes.
Never.
You don't believe your instruments, and you
Yeah.
fly into the mountain. And that's what we did. We flew into the side of the mountain. And we were young. It was my second year out of medical school. A colleague who was helping was a year older than me. He wasn't a surgeon either. We weren't surgeons. We didn't have an anaesthetist. We were just doing our best, and we stuffed that one up, that's for sure. The reason why I think about it all the time is that my 2-year-old daughter, Stephanie, I'm always going to the sandpit to stop her eating sand, because she does it too. And lots of children do this. It's really quite weird. I don't know what this is about. They do grow out of it.
But you also mentioned that you had to convince the father to let you do the surgery.
Yeah.
And then you had to go and tell him afterwards, which must have been terrible.
It was terrible. It was horrible. He didn't want to have surgery because there was a widespread belief amongst our African people that if you had surgery, you were going to die. And maybe they knew our capabilities. I don't know. It wasn't generally true. Generally, we got good results. But there was quite a widespread belief, if you go under the knife, you've had it. And he thought, no, this is not going to work. And it was the mother who persuaded him.
How long did it take you to move on from that?
Oh, I haven't yet. I still think about it a lot. That's.
But you've obviously got to go and do your job the next day.
Yeah. Oh, I see. From that point. No, well, you put it aside and you move on. I mean, it's still in my mind.
Amazing.
That's. I'd have to say it's probably the worst case I've ever had. That was just terrible.
So at some point you changed over to pathology. Why did you do that?
Well, it was a bit unexpected, the time at which I changed. Interestingly, pathology was my favourite subject at medical school. That and anatomy, which I suppose are related in some ways. And in fact, in my class, I was the only person who got honours in pathology in the exam. So it was always something that I had a special interest and feel for. I found every aspect of it fascinating. The microbiology, the forensics, the tissue, all of it was chemical pathology, was all absolutely fascinating. I'd put aside any thoughts of specialization because the war was on in Rhodesia. I was in the Airforce. Probably had another 4 years to go before anything would happen, before I'd be able to think about specializing. So I'd always had this in the back of my mind that I'd be a pathologist.
Right.
And then the war came to an end. As I said to you, we obtained the second place in the war games, and we were given the option of transferring to the Zimbabwean Air Force, or of leaving and transferring to the Royal Air Force.
So Zimbabwe being the new name for the
new
country.
Rhodesia, under Robert Mugabe. And I can't remember quite the details of it, but for some reason I was moved into the Royal Air Force and they paid me a pension. Or not, I suppose it wasn't a pension, it was a retainer. And I would be on their list or something for the next 20, 30 years. So they would send me this check every couple of months for £20, which was my retainer. I don't know what it was for, to buy a uniform or something. And eventually the bank manager said, look, you've got to stop this. It's costing us more to cash these things in. Anyway, eventually it did come to an end. So my service had ended prematurely, and suddenly I was at a loose end. The Royal Air Force didn't want me. So I had family in Cape Town. I went down there and I thought, well, I've always wanted to do pathology. So I phoned up the professor of pathology there, made an appointment to see him, and the rest was history. So it wasn't intended to start at that point, but That's when it did start.
Circumstances intervened.
Why pathology and not clinical medicine? I don't know. At one stage, I was very attracted to neurosurgery. As a house surgeon, I'd done been the house surgeon for Professor Lawrence Levy, who was a neurosurgeon. And basically, there was Lawrence Levy as the neurosurgeon. There was Coral Octoloni, who was a private neurosurgeon in town. And there was myself. And we were the neurosurgical team for 4.5 million people. And it was fascinating working for him. We worked 18 hours on, 6 off, endlessly.
Wow.
And Lawrence Levy did that all his life. His entire life he did that, and so did Coral Octoloni. They both died not a long time ago, in their 80s, and still doing exactly the same.
Amazing.
And I was very inspired by them, and they were very old school and very proper and very encouraging too.
Mm.
Yeah.
Can you remember your very first autopsy?
Yes, I can. And in fact, I was still in Rhodesia at the time, and I was in the center of the country, in a place called Gwello, where there was an Airforce base. And what I used to do every day in the Airforce, we'd start work at 6 in the morning and we'd finish at 2. The idea being that you had the aircraft all ready for training in the afternoon. And then the afternoons were free for sport. And I used to go up to the public hospital and operate up there and take over things. And one of the things that I took over was I'd do all the autopsies. So my first autopsy there was a man who had committed suicide, and he had a cancer of his larynx, and he had shot himself in the head. And it was the first one that I'd ever done. That was my first one that I did by myself. But the very first autopsy I ever saw was when I was 18 years old, and I'd just gone to medical school. Now, I was put through medical school by the Air Force. And during the vacations, I had to go back I was a serving member. And there'd been an aircraft accident. What had happened is a soldier had been injured. He and the medic were put in an aeroplane called a Trojan, which was a very underpowered Italian-built aircraft. It was an Aeromacchi of some sort. And it was late at night, and there was there was a bush strip. And what happened was the police put a Land Rover at one end of the strip and turned the lights on, and then the pilot was going to take off down the beam. And the front wheel of the Trojan hit the windscreen of the Land Rover as it lifted off. And of course they cartwheeled. And I was sent together with a group of other medics to go and pick up all the pieces and take them to the mortuary for an autopsy. And so we did that. That was the first time I'd ever done anything like that, and my first aircraft accident. And then the autopsy was carried out by my tutor to be Kevin Lee, and he was brilliant. He taught us everything on it and what he was doing, what he was looking at, and what the forces were involved, and the sort of things you look for in an aircraft accident.
So did you find it an unnerving experience at all, or were you more fascinated by the scientific side of it?
I was absolutely fascinated. I think then I was sold on it. Yeah. I was going to do it.
Yeah. What about when you first saw your first body that had a level of decomposition? That must be a different level of something to do.
Yeah. No, that's challenging. There's no question about that. We had quite a few of those during my medical school training. As medical students, we didn't have to do autopsies, but you had to go and observe them. And I was quite keen on it, so I went to watch quite a few. Probably saw 50 or 60 during my time. And as I used to go down and just watch them out of interest. And they used to bring in decomposed bodies there, and I'd watch the pathologists work on them. It takes about 10 seconds for frontal lobe inhibition to come in. Initially, you look at it and you're shocked and you think, I can't do this. And, the world goes sort of slightly yellow around you and you think the smell, and then a minute later it's gone. You just don't notice it anymore. And the brain's a funny thing.
I guess if you're focusing on the discovery and the scientific side, you've got something to focus on. For someone who's just watching and who doesn't have that background, it's probably a lot harder.
Yes. And I've done probably half a dozen here in New Zealand. When I was doing a lot of autopsy, they were keen for me to do it because I have no sense of smell.
Oh, you're the perfect man.
It's perfect, I'm in the ideal occupation. I suppose I could be an undertaker too. We went on a holiday to Fiji one year, and normally we flew out to the islands as we landed, but there was some glitch and we had to stay on the mainland, and I got dengue fever. There wasn't any dengue fever out on the islands because the mosquitoes can't reach that far, but I got dengue fever. And when I recovered from that, my sense of smell had gone, and it's never come back.
Wow.
So autopsies have been less of a problem for me. But initially it was a bit of a challenge because most people who have a sense of smell, that provides something like 80% of your taste of food too. And of course I found food tasteless, wine, everything was absolutely tasteless. But as time goes on, your taste buds improve and take over, and then you can start to taste things again.
You wrote about autopsies, or a few little bits and pieces I've gleaned out. To the uninitiated, autopsies are the stuff of nightmares, really. Another amusing one. An autopsy is a very liquid experience.
Yes.
And at first I found autopsies ghastly, but gradually I became accustomed to them and started noticing things, small things at first.
Yeah, I think that's true. And again, this is probably your frontal lobe inhibition. The thing that shocked me most in seeing an autopsy was the evisceration, the actual removal of the organs. The organs themselves is just like an anatomy lesson. But I remember the first time that I saw them open up to get the brain out, cut through the top of the scalp, and then they peeled the scalp down over the face. And I just saw this hair coming down over the face, and it's not right. That doesn't happen to people. That's what I mean. It's the stuff of a nightmare to see the whole of your scalp suddenly come down over your face.
Absolutely.
How can that happen? Now, of course, I realize it's actually just a tidy way of doing it so that you can close everything up and keep the cosmetic appearance of the body intact.
I've often wondered that there doesn't seem to be a lot of public negativity about this sort of thing happening to their families' bodies. Can a family refuse an autopsy if they really object? Or is it a legal requirement that we have to do it?
Well, it's both, really. The majority of autopsies are coronial, which means the coroner has possession of the body and he requires an autopsy. The families can object. They then have to go to a high court judge and get a judgment on whether their objection is accepted or not. I don't think in practice that's happened very often, if at all. So they don't need to give permission in that case. The coroner has possession of the body and he gives permission. In terms of having an autopsy, if you were to die in hospital and a hospital doctor wants to know what the hell was going on there, then they need the permission of the family of the next of kin to do that. And that, of course, you can refuse without any problem.
Right.
What is interesting is a few people have been to me and said they want an autopsy after they're dead. So they're live people have come and told me. You can't sign permission to have an autopsy while you're alive. You can. It doesn't mean anything. Because the second you die, I need the consent of the next of kin. And if they say no, it doesn't matter what you thought. You don't have it.
What would be their reasoning for wanting that?
Well, there'd been a couple. One of them was a person who wanted to leave their body to medical science.
But that would be different to having
Yeah.
an autopsy, wouldn't
Yeah.
it?
And as it turned out, there was no need for that. There wasn't a requirement for research. And they said, well, they really would like to have an autopsy anyway. So I said, well, all right. They'd had a neurological disorder. I said, okay, I'll do an autopsy on you if that's what you want. And when the person died, the relatives still wanted it, so I did it. The other one was a person who had been exposed to Agent Orange and some exposure. It might have been nuclear. I can't quite remember. It was one of those. And he was convinced that he had cancer of the bladder from this. And he wanted an autopsy basically to document it. So he came to see me. I did the autopsy on him, and interestingly, he didn't have any cancer at all. But that's the way it goes.
So in 1987, you immigrated to New Zealand.
Yes.
How did that all come about?
Well, I'd finished up in Cape Town, was now a specialist, and I thought it was time to move on. I mean, I'd gone through the war in Rhodesia, and South Africa didn't look as though they had any sort of great future ahead of them. You know, they were becoming quite drawing up into the lager, is the way they put it. You know, they're drawing the wagons up, and I thought, no, I don't really want to go through all this again. Once is enough. So I looked around the world and thought, well, you know, I'm a pathologist. Basically English-speaking pathologist. It's the United Kingdom, USA, Canada, Australia, or New Zealand are the places that I could go to. And, of course, I could register with my medical degrees in all of them except the United States at the end of the day, or maybe Canada. So I thought, well, New Zealand looks good. I didn't really want to go to the States or Canada because I'm not really into baseball or gridiron. You know, I'm a rugby and cricket fan. So I thought, go somewhere where the people at least think the same way you do.
Yeah.
So New Zealand looked good. And what I did is I wrote to every hospital board in New Zealand and said, I'm a pathologist. Here I am. You know, do you need one? And ultimately I got offers from a couple of places. They were quite interesting. Timaru was one, Palmerston North, and Gisborne. And the one I accepted was Gisborne.
Oh.
So I thought, that looks nice. You know, it's a really nice city, lots of sunshine, bit like Africa, really, a bit of a mixed population group, and you know, it looks quite fun. And they gave me a job there. And 2 weeks later, they phoned up and they said, oh, we have to withdraw the job because a New Zealander has now applied for the job. And the way the immigration things worked in those days is they had to give him precedence. So Dr. Singh went there, where he remained for probably 6 weeks and left. And
well, it was their loss.
In the meantime, I'd accepted a job in Palmerston North, so which was my second choice, and I now am the pathologist for Gisborne,
right.
which is interesting.
It's a bit strange.
I've come home. I've come home again.
So no family came out with you?
Yeah, my wife and child.
My but your parents and siblings?
No.
So do you still have family back in Zimbabwe?
I have nobody in Zimbabwe. I have a sister who lives in the Cape, and no other family alive anymore.
What cultural differences did you notice straight away when you started working in New Zealand as opposed to where you'd come from?
Culture or work related?
Culture in death, I guess, is what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
So work related.
Yeah. Well, I've talked to you about the differences in the approach to the dead here. But from a pathology perspective, there was an oddity in Africa. When we did autopsies on people, they took all the organs out and we dissected them. While we were dissecting them, the mortuary assistants would fill the body cavities up with sawdust. And if we'd taken the vertebral column and spine out, they'd put a broomstick in there, and they'd sew them up and give them back to the relatives like that. And we kept the organs. And the organs, we'd dissect them and so on, and they would just get incinerated. They weren't replaced back into the body. If we dissected a brain, it was fixed in formalin for a couple of weeks before we cut it. Whereas in New Zealand, everything goes back into the body and everything gets returned to the relatives. And that was a difference.
And that's always been the case even when you first arrived.
Oh, yeah. It's always been the case here. That was different. You know, I'd never seen that before. And I'd always thought the way they did it in Africa was the way they do it everywhere. I don't think it is. And it certainly probably isn't these days. But in those days, that's the way it was. That's how it was. That was thought to be the best practice.
And it wasn't because they had less respect for the dead than we did in New Zealand. It was just different.
That's just the way it was.
Yeah.
And, you know, all the organs used to be kept in tubs of formalin. And then on a Friday, they would have an autopsy meeting where all the pathologists would gather and the organs, the diseases would be demonstrated, and the physicians would come down from the hospital to see the organs of their cases. And then after that, they'd all be incinerated, all thrown in a bag and thrown into the incinerator.
And it seems amazing now, doesn't it?
Oh, I can't believe that we did that, but that's actually how it happened. That was the biggest change. Otherwise, everything that was done here is exactly the same. The pathology is the same, and that's why all the degrees and the things were all recognized and interrelated. They're all exactly the same.
So you told a little story about your first job when you got here, as a bit of a rookie, was an exhumation. Is that how you say the word?
Exhumation.
Exhumation.
Yeah, that was an oddity. I'd never done an exhumation before. We didn't dig people up in Africa. I don't think there would have been much left with the heat and the one thing and another. But there was an exhumation, and a policeman phoned me up and I said, "Exhumation? What for?" And he said, "Well, we've reason to believe a grave has been interfered with." And I said, "What do you mean interfered with?" And he said, "Well, the nameplate from the top of the coffin was found lying on the grass next door to it." I said, "Oh, no." And I said, "I suppose now," this is black humor, I said, "I suppose you do this at 3 a.m. He said, "No, we do." And I said, "No, you're joking."
On a cold, foggy night.
On a cold, foggy, and it was a cold, foggy night. And he said, "No, we do." And I said, "What? Why?" And he said, "Well, there's a school opposite. This is in Foxton." He said, "There's a school opposite or just down the road." And he said, "You know, we can't actually do an exhumation with people wandering, driving backwards and forwards. We have to do it in the middle of the night." And so we did. We went out there, and it was a cold and foggy night. And I had no idea where Foxton was. I had no idea how to find it. And of course, you didn't have GPS in those days. And there was a fog. It was just unbelievable. And eventually I found the graveyard. And eventually we got there and got digging, and it was eerie. It was very, very strange. They had a priest there too. A whole lot of police, all sorts of people. An undertaker dressed very formally. You know, I think...
Straight out of a movie.
Yeah, it was just like out of a movie. And anyway, they dig down, and it took forever to dig down. And as they dug down, they'd find buried flowers from above and so on. So clearly somebody had been there.
Right.
And eventually we got down to the coffin, and it was they were sweating to get all that soil out. Maybe they were just doing it very fast, I don't know. And then we couldn't get the coffin lid off because we didn't know how to release it. It had clips on it. It wasn't nailed down. It had clips on it. Anyway, the undertaker went down there, and you know, we lowered him in his with his cravat and his waistcoat and down into the grave, and suddenly the lid came flying out, followed by him. And then I stood there and looked at this and thought, I don't know if I can do this. Went and shone the torch down there, and it was actually beautiful.
The body was there.
Yeah, the body was lying there, it wrapped up in cloth and covered with this luminescent fuzz of fungus. And it was actually phosphorescent almost. It was glowing. And I thought there'd be the smell of death. And this sweet smell of honey came out of I don't know what this was. Yeah, I went down there and I had a look and I said, look, I don't think there's any point bringing this body out because clearly it has not been interfered with at all. And there was a senior policeman who'd driven up from Wellington, or inspector, I think, and he looked down there and we agreed. We said, no, just close it up. This is fine. When I found out subsequently, I was after my book was published, I was contacted by an expert in fungi from India, a mycologist, who has a daughter who works in a laboratory somewhere in New Zealand, and she had sent him the book, and he contacted me. He said, I know this fungus. He said it's called the candle snuff fungus, which I thought was a beautiful name, candle snuff. And he said, you're absolutely right. It shows bioluminescence, and it produces a very sweet smell.
Wow.
And he said, I've never heard of it growing inside a coffin.
Probably no one's been down to look before.
Well, I don't think anybody's I've never heard of it before. But I'd asked the experts at Massey, and they had no idea what it was. But this mycologist from India said, no, he knew what it was.
Pretty interesting first job.
Lovely name. And when I came to write this up, I couldn't find my notes to say who was there, because I'd kept all this. I just couldn't put my hand on them. And I needed to find the date, and eventually I found that because I found my car logbook and I'd claimed the mileage off tax. So I managed to find the date. But I then asked the police, could I see their files on it? And they couldn't find anything. And the CIB had a very good look to see if they could find it. Couldn't find anything at all. And did I imagine, or was this a dream of some sort? Anyway, I wrote it up, and after it was published, I was down in the mortuary one day, and a policeman came in there and said, he said, I've read your book. He said, that exhumation, he said, that was my first job as a policeman.
Wow.
He said, I was there that night, and we talked about it. He said, it's exactly as you said it. He said, it just took me straight back to that.
Nice.
And that was the police couldn't find any files on it at all, so it was all very odd.
Yeah. It's a bit of a random occurrence to happen for him to see that. Can I just ask about a subject that comes across in every murder, and that's calculating the time of death, not just murders. We think of it to the uninitiated as a science, but from reading your books, it seems like it's more a black art. There seems so many variables, a very difficult task to do accurately, but you're always asked to do it.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about the methods you use to calculate the time of death as best as you can?
It's an interesting task, and of course everybody knows you need a time of death so that you can tie the perpetrator, the murderer, to the victim. That's why you need it, and that's why the police always want to know down to the second, when did the person die. So it is critically important, and the methods that we use a lot of them have been known and worked on for 150 years, and we're pretty useless at it still. It's really difficult. I mean, the obvious one is rigor mortis. When you die, your body stiffens, your muscles stiffen up, and depending on a lot of things, they stiffen up at a fixed rate. So basically, you've got fixed rigor mortis at about 10 hours and a little bit less before, and it starts off in the small muscles of the hands and the jaws and so on, and then spreads to the big muscles. So depending on which muscle group is involved and whether it's fixed and whether you can move any of the limbs, you can come up with a time. Not hugely reliable. It's plus minus 15 hours. Right. So it doesn't help you. So you can say 10 o'clock at night plus minus 15 hours. I mean, that's a day on either side. It doesn't really help you. Then there's the issue of lividity. When you're alive, your heart beats and the blood goes round and round. When you die, your heart stops and the blood stops going round and it sinks down under gravity to the lowest level. So if you die sitting in a chair, It sinks down and accumulates in your legs. And your skin becomes very dark and magenta colored in a European Caucasian person. And that's the blood settling out there. Now it settles out because it's under gravity at a sort of predictable rate.
Right.
And after a while it clots there and stops. And you can't make it go away. But initially you can push your thumb against it and push it out the way. Depending on where it is and how long it's been there, you can come up with a time. And again, plus minus 8-9 hours. There's a whole pattern that we look at. Then there's body temperature. Now this is the one a lot of people know about. Was the body cold? I knew he was dead because it was cold. When you're alive, your temperature is 37.2. And when you die, it starts to cool off till it reaches room temperature. And there's a law of physics about cooling of bodies that it's a straight line. So if you know the temperature now and you draw a straight line back up to 37 degrees, you can say when it happened. The problem is that a body it's hotter on the inside than it is on the skin. So it doesn't cool down at a fixed rate. So that's a problem. The other problem is if you are of a larger build, then you cool down much slower. And if you're skinny, you cool down much faster. If you've got lots of clothes on, you cool down much slower. And if you're naked, you cool down much faster. So there are lots of variables. And you've got to take the temperature of the body, you've got to take the temperature of the environment, you've got to put them all into a formula, and you come out with a time. Sort of plus minus 7-8 hours again. So, none of them are doing terribly well. All of these are a problem. And then there are odd things. I mean, those are the traditional ones. And then there's one where you take fluid from the eyeball. And this one that's the one time I've seen a policeman nearly faint. And the story is this. Every cell in your body pumps sodium into the cell. Pumps potassium into the cell and sodium out. And that keeps your membranes working and your cell is alive. What happens when you die? Those pumps stop and the potassium starts leaking out. And in the fluid behind your eye, when all the cells around your retina die, they start leaking potassium. And they leak it at a predictable sort of rate.
Mm.
So if you can measure the potassium in the eyeball, you can put it into a formula and come up with a time. You've got 2 eyeballs, so you can do one now and one in 8 hours' time and see what the differences are. None of them are hugely reliable.
Is that more accurate than the other ones you mentioned, the temperature and the rigor mortis?
Not hugely, a bit more accurate. Not hugely, a bit more, but not a lot. And then there are the oddities, such as came up in the Lundy case, of gastric emptying. So if you knew when a person had eaten a meal, and you can then look at autopsy at their stomach and see what the state of play is there, you can form an estimate of how long it is since they died, because presumably when they die, they stop emptying their stomach. And that's a problem, and some people accept it and some people don't. Now, in the Lundy case, for instance, both of the victims had stomachs that were full of undigested food. And for that reason, the pathologist, my good friend James Pang, said that death would have occurred about an hour after they ate. Now that was quite contentious when we got to the Privy Council, and there were pathologists who said it's not true and you can't use it, etc., etc. But there is a lot of evidence that that's the case. Anaesthetists will tell you that when they have to do an emergency anaesthetic on a traffic accident victim, stomach's empty in about an hour and a quarter. They know this. It's well known in anaesthetics, and they're dealing with living people, so they know. And there is a professor in London, David Silk, who studies abnormalities of stomach function in the living, and he treats it. And he's devised a test where he gives you a mixture of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins with a radioactive marker. You swallow this, and you work out how long you can then, by monitoring the radioactivity, you can work out how long the food stays in the stomach. And he told me that he's done 10,000 of these on normal people.
Wow.
And after about an hour, 80% of the food is gone. So there is evidence that it works. Now, in the Lundy case, it led to a lot of controversy. So there are various methods like that. They're not terribly reliable.
So I suppose this is all very problematic in murder cases, because if you can only give an estimate of hours or 8 hours, it's just so easily refutable.
Well, that's right, because defense lawyers will do that. They'll take each little thing, each little bit, and say, well, how reliable is that? And at the end, they'll say, well, everything you've told me doesn't work. In aggregate, you might actually be getting the same answer from every one of them, which is starting to look a bit suspicious that maybe it's right.
Yeah.
And I have one case, which I think I talk about in my second book, Stinson, the paedophile who was killed at the chicken ranch. All of his markers came out about exactly the same, saying that he died at about 10:30 on Friday night. They all came out with much the same answer. And interestingly, when Tamatea, who had murdered him, confessed, he said, yeah, it was about 10:15 that he took him down. So it actually all fitted together very nicely. So it can work, but whether that was just luck, I don't know.
How often do you find nothing in an autopsy or no cause of death?
Traditionally, 10% is what pathologists say.
Right.
Your autopsy should find nothing. That was something that came up in when I first came to New Zealand. I had to go, I think it was down to Levin, to the coroner down there. And it was an autopsy. I'd found nothing. And he said, but how can you find nothing? He said, I've had many pathologists appear for me, and I've never had a finding of nothing. Surely there must be something. So I said, no, well, it's most likely that he's died of a cardiac arrhythmia. And he said, but surely you would find something. I said, no, it's an electrical problem. It flares up, you'll die, and you'll be nothing to find. And that's quite acceptable. And he was very skeptical. And I said to him, well, you just got to look at Richard Hadley, the cricketer, because he had had an arrhythmia, I think, on the field, and they'd had to take him off, and he'd had to have some sort of pacemaker put in. I said, he could have died there and you would have found nothing. And only then did he accept it.
Because to me, it's surprising. I mean, it's obvious when you understand the reasoning, like you're saying. Yeah. But to us uninitiated, you would think you cut open a body, there has to be some reason why that person died, and you must be able to find it. But electrical reasons make perfect sense. And I guess there's chemical reasons that disappear, where the chemicals will disappear and you can't see them as well, is there?
Correct. And then there are the various toxins. I mean, you're going to talk about Jason Chase later. Sometimes you can do all the tests and you won't find the toxins. I remember the pathologist that I took over from here, Roy Darby, told me that there'd been a suicide that he had dealt with, and it was somebody at Massey University who had access to snake venom, and he had killed himself by injecting himself with the snake venom. And he said, there was absolutely nothing to find.
What about cot deaths? Would they fall into this category?
Yes, of course, because they usually find very minor changes, and of course the mechanism of cot death is now quite well known, and it's basically the upper respiratory tract of infants is quite narrow, and if they have a minor cold, it swells up a bit, and if they're lying on their front face down, that further obstructs the upper airway, and they don't have the strength to actually lift their head up to take a breath. So that's the sort of mechanism that most of them occur with. Some of them, of course, do have other things like inherited disorders and so on. But that's the old unknown cot death is that group.
Yeah.
And now we've eliminated that more or less by sleeping children on their backs.
Yeah. Autopsying young babies must be tough, is it?
Yeah, that babies I've never had a problem with. I'm not quite sure why that is. Young children, certainly, I find that terrible. And we've had a couple of events where I've had to go and do them because my registrars just can't face it. They don't want to do it.
Mm.
But the way I see it is, they my patients. You're looking after them. You're doing them. It's a service to them. We're treating them.
Yeah, that's right. Do you want to talk about the Jason case?
Jason Chase. Yeah.
Sorry, the Jason Chase case. And that's something I was thinking, we use the word case or story, but these are actually people, and I just wanted to say that and acknowledge that. I mean, they are a case, but they were alive, they've got family, they often died a tragic, shocking death. So they're not a case, they're a person.
They're a person. It's their story.
Yeah. So let's tell his story, because
Jason's
was a story of an unexplained death and for a long time.
Yeah, no, Jason is a fine young lad from Dannyburg, a Maori lad, a farm worker there, very well liked. And he went up into the Ruahinis for a bit of time out, which he did from time to time. Took his sleeping bag and some food and some water and so on, and never came out. And this was in December 2002. And his family reported that he hadn't come out. And the police and rescue people mounted a search, which went on until Christmas Eve, and then they called it off. Couldn't find him. And his whānau weren't prepared to accept this, so they put together called up people to go and look, and eventually they got 700 people motivated, searching the Ruahinis, and the police tried to stop them because they said somebody's going to get lost up there and we're going to have the same problem. But they went on. It was a farmer from Pongaroa who provided an aircraft to help look. And eventually on the 3rd of January, they found his body. And I did the autopsy on him. He'd been out in the open dead for a little while. So the cause of death, we had to establish that using different criteria to the one that those that I've described earlier.
Time of death, you mean?
Time of death, yeah, time of death. Because that became quite important. How long had he been there? And I spent quite a bit of time working on that. But there was nothing to find, basically. From the cause of death perspective, there was absolutely nothing to find. He had no injuries. He had no medical disease. Toxicology on him was negative. There was nothing to find. He was just lying there in the open, in the creek, wearing shorts, a shirt. His backpack and his water bottle were reasonably close by. There was just no reason why he was dead. It made no sense at all. All the toxicology, drugs of abuse, all the things we did, all negative. And I had to record a verdict of unknown causes. And that went down a bit like a lead balloon in the coroner's court with the whānau there, but there was just nothing to find. And so it remained for 16 years.
Wow. Was the family suspecting foul play, or just a complete unknown?
No, they wanted to know, but they didn't suspect foul play.
Right.
But like the coroner in Levin, they couldn't believe that you can do all this and you don't know what it is. I didn't know. And 16 years later, I was having, after having written my first book, I was having tea with John Coots, a retired general surgeon that I'd worked with. And I told him the story. And he said, "Oh, I know what that is." He said, I think you'll find he was found in Nettle Creek. He said, he's walked into onga nettles. And I said, never heard of them. And he said, hang on. And he went up into his files and he came out with a pile of papers. And he said, in 1961, he said, 2 young men went hunting up there. And they came out at dusk into that Nettle Creek and they walked through the nettles there. That's why it's called Nettle Creek.
Mm.
And within 5 hours, the first one was dead. The other one survived, but he was a couple of weeks in Dannyburg Hospital. And he said, "This is a deadly nettle." I couldn't believe it. So I went to find out, and sure enough, that's exactly where they found him, in Nettle Creek. And when we went into it, it all became obvious. Put yourself in the mind of the young man. He'd decided to come out, and the hunters up there said, "You always avoid Nettle Creek." But the right way down was about 200 meters beyond Nettle Creek. And we reckon that what happened is, in the dusk, he came down and he took that one because he thought that was the way down to out of there. And in the dusk, like the two hunters in 1961, he walked through those nettles. And then trying to walk out, he lost consciousness and died. And I've always said to people, I don't know what killed Jason Chase. If it had been Africa, I would have said a snake bite, because that's exactly what you see. We're pretty sure that's what it was. And I went and spent the day up in Dannyburg, met with the whānau up there. We spent the day talking about it. And
this is 16 years later.
16 years later, yeah. Went through it all, and the local hunters came and said, no, they knew all about this. And we decided, well, that is the cause of death. It wasn't suicide. He had water, he had food, he had no reason not to walk out. And that was clearly what had done it. The interesting thing was around assessing the time of death that he had. Now, there was no way that we could use rigor mortis or anything, because he'd been out in the open for some time. But there were some things that we could do. And the blowflies had arrived, and they'd laid their eggs, and the maggots were beginning to hatch. And so I collected all the maggots and the eggs and everything from around the body, boiled them up to stop them growing, and sent them to the entomologist at Wallaceville. And the interesting thing about blowflies is they are like the African vulture. They can sense death. I think they arrive before you die. In Africa, you look up and the sky is blue. And if you shoot an animal, within 30 seconds, the first vulture's circling, and within half an hour, there are 200 in the trees all around. And the blowflies like that. When you die, they're there like a shot, and they lay their eggs in the corner of your eye, your nostrils, corner of the mouth. Look like little grains of rice. 24 hours later, that hatches into the first maggot, which measures a certain length. 24 hours after that, that first maggot splits its skin into the next one, which has got a certain length, a known length. 24 hours later, the next one. And so it goes on until you get a cocoon, and then it rehatches. So if you've got a whole lot of them, you can say, well, I've got eggs, I've got this size, this size, this size, and you can work it all out and come out with a time. How many days has he been there?
You just need a tough stomach to be able to do this.
To boil maggots. Yeah, it doesn't do it for me. So the entomologist came back and said 3 to 4 days. Been there 3 to 4 days.
But he was missing for weeks.
Yeah, he'd been missing for weeks. So he'd been up there. Either he didn't want to be found or he was somewhere else. But he'd only been lying there dead 2 or 3 days.
And did that line up with what you suspected from autopsy?
Now that's the interesting thing. So the maggots were the one thing. The second thing was decomposition. Now we can't do rigor mortis, but when a person dies, what happens to them? They liquefy. You turn into liquid. You've seen it with, if you take an apricot, for instance, and you just put it out there, it'll rot and it'll turn into liquid and disappear. But if you fix that, if you preserve it, you end up with these dried apricots that you buy in the supermarket, and they'll last 100 years. So liquefaction is what normally happens to us. But it doesn't always happen. If you die in the desert and you're in a dry environment, you mummify. And you don't turn into liquid. And they have found mummies now that are 2,000-3,000 years old. You can still get the DNA out of them. They've still got their fingerprints. Looking at Jason, he had not liquefied. He had not decomposed markedly. But what he had was early mummification. The tips of his fingers, the tip of his nose, the tips of his ears, and the tips of his toes were all dried and mummified. Now, mummification only happens when it's warm and dry. In a wet environment, you will liquefy. So I got the weather patterns for the area from Danny Verk, and it turned out from the time he had disappeared on the 13th of December to the 31st of December, it was cold up there. It was 17, 18 degrees and less, and it was raining steadily. It was 25 mils on Christmas Day. On the 1st of January, sorry, the 31st of December, temperature went up to 30 degrees. It was dry and hot. We had 3 days, because he was found on the 3rd of January. We had 3 days of dry and heat. So that fitted again with about the 31st, 3-4 days that he'd been lying there. And then there were 1 or 2 blood tests that we did. You can actually, looking at the types of alcohol in the blood from decomposition, you can get an idea of how long he'd been there. And the ESR people thought probably 3-4 days would be right.
So it's all tying up.
So it all tied in.
Yeah.
So I said to the finder, we found him on the 3rd. I reckon 31st it's about then. That's the day he decided to walk out. And they went with that because one of their family members, who's supposed to have a bit of a gift of prophecy, had had a dream that night in which Jason came to her and said, "Stop looking for me, I'm dead." And so we said, must be it then. Their method is probably as accurate as any of my scientific methods, if the truth be known.
But I bet they were very appreciative of you. I mean, that's beyond expectations for the pathologist to 16 years later still be thinking about this, trying to solve it, and then take the time to come and talk to the family. I mean, that wouldn't be normal, I wouldn't have thought. But
no, it's not usual, but that's the most interesting case that I've had. It always puzzled me. That's why I talked about it so much. What did he die from? This makes no sense. I'd put myself in his mind. I couldn't see anything there. Now, the interesting thing was, when I told the rescue people and the police about the Onga Onga nettle, you know what they said? Never heard of it.
Really?
And they said, but we go up there often looking for people. We didn't realize this was a problem. Everybody who lives over that side knows all about this, and this is a deadly nettle. It really is. Lots of people have got stories about their dogs being killed. People have talked about horses being killed. It's the most deadly
Nasty
nettle
stuff,
in the entire world.
Yeah.
It's a terrible thing.
Interesting story. Can we talk about murder? Everyone wants to talk about murder.
Everybody wants to talk about murder.
Why is it that everyone wants to talk about it? And you've said that the human fascination with murder is profound. I've spent my professional life in pathology involved with the most fascinating diseases and diagnoses, many quite unbelievable, but at dinner parties, everyone wants to know about murder.
That's right. I think it's maybe we are fascinated with the dark side of our character. Maybe we all carry it within ourselves, and we probably do. I mean, it's probably a bit off the point, but my father, when he was old, he used to talk about his experience in the desert in the war, and he said, how could we kill people like that? That's legitimate murder. That's legalized murder. And we accept that. We're very proud of our SAS and so on. We accept legitimized or legalized murder is okay. But we all know that deep down inside ourselves, we've got some capacity, a dark capacity there, which we shouldn't have. And maybe that's where the fascination comes. I don't know why people are so fascinated, but I've given a lot of talks recently, and what's the commonest question that I get asked? What do you think about the Polkinghorne case? They all ask that. I mean, it's amazing. Everybody's fascinated
As if you're an expert of why someone did something.
Yeah, no, that's right.
And another thing you say that people ask a lot, I think you spoke about this in your latest book launch, correct me if I'm wrong, is how to commit the perfect murder.
Yes.
Which sounds like an interesting story. or some interesting thoughts. You said, what if a murder apparently has no motive at all? And I've never thought of this, but it's an interesting concept. That makes everything so much harder, for motive ties a murderer to their victim almost as powerfully as their having no alibi for the time of death. A perfect murder ideally would have no discernible motive to direct the police investigation towards the murderer. Which, yep, I agree with that. But it makes it all hypothetical, because if there's no motive, why would someone do it?
Exactly right. But I guess, and there are cases like that just make no sense. There may be a motive, there may not. There was that case a little while ago. I can't remember the exact details, but it was a road worker somewhere, and somebody shot him by the side of the road, drove up and shot him and drove off, and they never found out who it was. And it just made no sense at all. I don't know if you remember it. It was a couple of years ago here in New Zealand, and that it's just bizarre. Serial killers are the ultimate one. They have a motive, they have an inner motive, but there's no link. They're going to kill somebody. They'll pick up somebody from the side of the road. Anyone will do. The next woman who comes along, I'll take her. I've got no link and no motive. The reason why serial killers get caught is that they do it again and again, and eventually they make a mistake.
But I guess to the rest of us, the motive is very vague, because it's not a specific person. There's no revenge. There's no logic to it to us. So you could almost say there's no motive apart from the fact they need to keep killing.
No, that's right. Their motive is an internal one. There isn't a love affair or an insurance policy or
there's
money
nothing
involved
tied to that particular victim.
There's nothing tied to that. One of the cases I talk about is the the final diagnosis is about Colin Bauer, the psychiatrist in Dunedin, who murdered his wife with anti-diabetic drugs. Now, the police, as I always point out to people, when they investigate a murder, the first thing they do, policing 101, is they look at the partner, the husband or the wife, because it's usually them. And they looked immediately at Colin Bauer, and did he have a motive? And yes, he had a girlfriend. He formed a liaison with a colleague, Dr. Anne Walsh, and he had ideas of making her the new Mrs. Bauer. He had a motive. There was also an insurance policy, which might or might not have been a motive. We don't know. But the police now had a motive. If there'd been no motive, it would have been a lot harder to say we need to look further at this man.
Can you tell the Jack and the Beanstalk story?
That's not in any of my books.
No, but I read that you did tell it.
Yeah. No, I spend quite a lot of time reading stories to my 2-year-old daughter, Stephanie. She's a bit of a book addict. And reading Jack and the Beanstalk, it suddenly occurred to me that we've got this all wrong. This story, the way we understand it, Jack is the hero and the giant is the villain. But in fact, if you think about the story, we've got it all the wrong way round. Jack is a poor boy. He comes from a decile 1 family. They've got nothing. And his mother sends him to market to sell their cow. And what does he do? He meets a strange man on the way to the market, and he swaps the cow for some seeds or pills or something. And he gets home to his mother, tells him what she's done, and she says, "Are you sure he isn't a drug dealer? What do you mean he's given you 5 magic beans? That's absolute rubbish. I'm not having Class A drugs in my house." And she throws them out the window. And the next morning, Jack realizes he's stuffed up big time. And he thinks, well, he better redress this. So what does he do? He finds his way to an upmarket neighborhood where he breaks into a man's home. And this man is physically disadvantaged. He suffers from gigantism. It's a pituitary disorder. But nonetheless, he's managed to make his way in life. He's built a castle. He's accumulated enough wealth to keep him and his wife in a reasonable way. Jack breaks into the house by getting the confidence of his wife, pleading that he's hungry. She brings him in, she feeds him. And what does he do? How does he reward this? Not once, but 3 times. He steals from this disadvantaged man. He steals all his money. And on the 3rd event, the man wakes up and sees Jack, and what does any red-blooded Kiwi do? He chases after him to catch him. He's going to make a citizen's arrest. Jack runs off, runs home, shouting for his mother to bring him an axe, and using this, he brings about the giant's death. Jack now has no remorse. The victim's statement from the giant's wife, we don't hear that. She's now left not knowing what happened to her husband. He's been murdered. She's got no money. And what did Jack and his mother do? They use all this money and they go and live happily ever after, spending the money on plastic surgeons and yachts and goodness knows what. This is homicide. And Jack's mother is an accomplice to this. So the whole story is actually wrong. When you look at it from a moral perspective or from the perspective of a member of the CIB or a pathologist's perspective, this is homicide. I think Jack would probably get life imprisonment.
You sound quite bitter about this.
Well, I've been misled.
I can just imagine you reading this to your old, growing angry and irate and bitter.
The more I read it, the more I thought, I can't believe this. This is not right.
But you can clearly see that, you're thinking from the perspective of someone who's seen so many different cases like this, and you're coming from a whole different angle. Yeah. There's a very interesting murder case involving Daniel Luff that you write about. He took the life of police officer Duncan Taylor.
Oh, yes.
He was a 17-year-old lad.
Yeah.
I think had an obsession with a previous girlfriend and locked him up in the house.
Yeah.
And when the police came to look into it, he shot them.
Yeah.
And it seems fairly cut and dry. You did an autopsy. But what's interesting about this case, I found, is that his life in prison, he's really rehabilitated himself.
Yeah.
And you talk about it, and I've read about it, and it's a very interesting story.
It is fascinating, yeah.
Have you spoken to him or his family at all?
I haven't. No, not at all. I found it. He was an unusual 17-year-old in that he had some talents. He was very good at repairing and building up Land Rovers, and he was very into locks, and he could open and close locks, and he was definitely quite an unusual 17-year-old. And he certainly stuffed up big time. I mean, there's no question about that. His obsession with his ex-girlfriend and his taking a rifle round to her place and, shooting the police. I mean, what can you say? But he seems to have spent a life in prison where he has educated himself, and I think he went on to do a master's or a PhD.
And a PhD, I think.
And a PhD. And rehabilitated himself, certainly from an educational sense. And I think he's out on, I think he was
released a couple of years ago.
And I think he has to stay in the South Island.
Something like that. He did a PhD investigating the aspects of the rehabilitation process.
Yes.
And he actually said his imprisonment was deserved, all for poor decisions motivated by a mix of immaturity, self-centeredness, institutionalization, and boredom. And you can see this. A 17-year-old, none of us were thinking clearly at 17.
Of course.
You're in a bit of a wrong situation. You can see this happening. But I've read that, a lot of negativity about his rehabilitation, how his study was funded by the taxpayer in prison. He didn't have to worry about feeding himself or earning an income. It was all just handed, and we shouldn't be doing this sort of thing. But what you
Yeah.
wrote about it is we have to keep faith in the chance of ultimate redemption for all of us, for that is what makes society civilized rather than blindly retributive. Otherwise, what's the point? Even more lives are wasted and tragedy is heaped on tragedy.
Mm.
So, yeah, I just found that an interesting case.
Mm.
From an interviewing perspective, I thought he's be a very interesting person to interview.
Yeah, no, he certainly would be. I think redemption, you've got to hold on to redemption, or else why do we have a prison service? I guess in historically our cultural home, Britain, perhaps they didn't believe in redemption, so they put them on ships and sent them to Australia.
Mm.
We don't have the option of not keeping these people in our society. We don't have a death penalty, so you can't remove them that way, and you can't transport them somewhere else.
The only option is to keep them locked up forever, really, isn't it? And have a
Yeah,
legal system. But,
yeah. And,
that's not.
I look at the American system where they sentence people to 286 years in prison or 590 years in prison.
Yeah,
How does that work? I mean, does that mean that they never get out? Or that
I assume so.
there's no chance of redemption? I find that they talk about cruel and unusual punishment. That has to be up there.
I think there's cases where some people deserve to never come back into society.
Yeah.
Cruel, evil people that show no remorse. But in cases like this, it's just quite different, it seems to me. And we all make mistakes, and even though it's such a terrible mistake, there should be a chance of recovering at some point from it.
I mean, they do give down sentences. I think the sentences for murder are for life, but the minimum parole period. So you have to say there's 17 years before you're due for parole. But if you have fulfilled all the criteria, you can be paroled. But some, like the Christchurch terrorist, is sentenced to life forever. There is no parole period. He'll never get out.
Yeah.
And that's appropriate.
Mm. You have a section in the final diagnosis about your thoughts on high-profile cases, some which you haven't had direct involvement in. And you discuss briefly the Ben Smart and the Olivia Hope case. And you have an interesting theory, I guess it is, how memory works. That was a case really reliant on people's recollections and memory of the boat and how many masts and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I guess eyewitness evidence is there. There are a number of types of evidence. I'll start that again. There's circumstantial evidence, which you usually find support groups for murderers always say, oh, the evidence was only circumstantial. And usually that's the best evidence because you can't create it, or it's almost impossible to create. So circumstantial's very good evidence. Eyewitness evidence is very poor. DNA evidence is probably very good because it's got a very high level of probability associated with it. But eyewitness evidence, it may be valuable in a court of law, but in the court of science, it's not worth very much. Eyewitnesses change their mind. They're not sure what they saw. No two people standing together necessarily see the same thing, and they will all remain convinced of that. In the Sounds murder, the Olivia Hope and Ben Smart, in that particular case, it is almost all eyewitness evidence. And it is intriguing how quickly it changed. The police took affidavits from most of the important witnesses who were there within a day or two of the disappearance. They took further statements a month later, and they differ substantially from each other. And then what those same people have said as the years have gone by have also changed substantially. And I give some examples in the book about they say this on one place and now they believe completely the opposite. And I make the point in the book that none of those witnesses are lying.
Which is an important point, isn't it?
They're not trying to hide a crime. They're telling it the way they remember it. And the way they remember it is how they last remembered it. And I think that one of the theories of memory, which I think is probably an accurate model, it's similar to a Word document in the computer. You type what you want on the Word document, and you save it. You call it up and it's there, you type some more and you save it. Next time you call it up, you're not seeing the first one, you're seeing the last one. And one of the theories of memory is that what you remember is when you last thought about it, or when you last talked about it, or when you last saw a documentary on television about it. And the Sounds murder is like that. We've seen so much on television, so many enactments, so many documentaries made. We all have a view on what happened and what it looked like. I can describe that catch absolutely to you, and yet maybe it never even existed. But I can draw it for you. I can know the ketch with the blue line down the side and the brass portholes and the two big masts. I can draw it for you. It may not even have existed, but it's in my mind.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It's crazy. And I can tell you exactly what Scott Watson looks like from his identikit picture. I've seen it so many times, but it's not necessarily accurate. It doesn't mean anything. And so they talk about having another trial for Scott Watson. Really? Are they going to call those people to give another account now, all these years later? What's it going to be worth?
Do you think he's guilty?
I don't know. I don't think that there's enough evidence to say that. I mean, it's like the question I get asked about Polkinghorne too. In a murder trial, you have to be beyond a reasonable doubt. There's a lower level, which is on the balance of probabilities. That isn't what's in place.
You can't convict someone for that.
You can't convict someone for that. But interestingly, my understanding is that if you have a murder case and somebody's found innocent and you libel them by saying they did it, if they have a libel case against you, that becomes on balance of probabilities. So I suspect that most murderers wouldn't want to go to that. Who have got away with it in the first trial wouldn't want to go to that. I'm not sure whether that's true, but a lawyer once told me that.
It's amazing with that case, every time you see a documentary that purports a particular theory, it seems so convincing. They'll focus on one particular angle and you think, wow, it's just so obvious. And then you see a different angle and that's so obvious. And you start to see the challenges in a case like this, especially so many years later.
It's a real problem. And of course, the water taxi driver who described the catch is Guy Wallace, who I gather has died. So he's not available to give evidence. But in his first affidavit, he and I've read this, he says to the police that what really stood out was how low in the middle this boat was. While I was sitting in the water taxi, I could reach up and with my hand, I could hold on to the top rail of the deck rail that goes around it. That's what he said in his first affidavit. In the movie that was made by the support group, Murder on the Blade 2003, there's Guy Wallace standing in his water taxi next to a ketch with his hand up like this, and he can just touch the top of the deck. And he says, yep, it was this. It was exactly like this. Now, which one was it? In his affidavit the day afterwards, he said it was very low in the middle. It's what they would have called a wet boat. There would have been a lot of water coming in. Those are his words. And now he's standing there and saying, yep, this was it. He's not making that up. That's why he remembers it now. So what would that evidence be worth?
Another case that you were directly involved in, which you mentioned before, was the Mark Lundy case.
Yes.
A very high-profile case. When did you first realise this case was going to be controversial, attacking your professional expertise? I think it would be fair to say in a lot of it.
Yeah, I think right from the beginning, when Ross Grantham first arrived with a slide, and he came into this office, and he had a slide that had been made at the ESR from Mark Lundy's shirt, and what the scientist there had done is he had picked up that there was some tissue on the shirt, and he had dabbed a little bit of saline on and just wiped it off. And he said, I think there's something there, but I don't know. And Ross Grantham brought it up here, and we looked at it and we said, this is brain tissue. Nobody had suggested it to us. We all looked at it and we said, this is brain tissue. And of course, it turned out to be so. And the world experts have now confirmed that and done electron microscopy and so on. But right throughout we realized that this would be a problem and would have to be proven. So that's why we recommended that they refer it to an expert in the United States who could actually carry out tests to prove quite unequivocally that this was brain tissue, which is what happened. And I remember saying to Ross Grantham, we can't do this in Palmerston North. Nobody will believe us. It has to be done by somebody who's an expert.
But that expert took a lot of criticism too, didn't he?
He did. But what happened was, in the Privy Council, this to my mind is the crunch of it. In the Privy Council, different views were presented. My view was presented. I sat through that for 3 days and listened to every word. It was brilliant experience. My evidence was presented, Miller's evidence, all the evidence saying it was brain tissue was presented, and the evidence that it wasn't was presented. Fine, okay, there are two opinions. Lord Hughes of Ombersley had been the president of the criminal court in Britain, and he was a smart man. He was used to dealing with murders. And he said to the Crown prosecutor, the Crown solicitor, there, he said, you've got one set of experts who say one thing and one set of experts who say another. He said, what do you want me to do? You want me to pick one? He said, how would I know? I'm a lawyer. And he was right.
Mm-hmm.
He was absolutely right. And in most trials, that lawyers don't like to actually say that. How would I know? I'm just a lawyer. But that's what he said. And he said, what you need to do is go and get the world experts and put them in one laboratory with all the material, and then they can tell us what the truth is. And that's what they did for the third trial. They got for Professor Colin Smith from Edinburgh for Mark Lundy, and they got Daniel Duplessis from Southampton for the Crown, probably the two world experts in forensic neuropathology. And they said beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt, this is brain tissue. And they did all the tests on it. They did electron microscopy on it. And they said to have any other view is equivalent to medieval alchemy. You know, they were absolutely certain about it. And I think at the end of the day, it's not, you may have professional views, an opinion or whatever, but there's only one of them can be right. And the truth can only be there once. And it's not up to the courts to decide. It's up to the experts.
Which is, it's such an interesting thing to try and get your head around, especially for those of us that don't know anything about it. And that's this whole thing about what's fact and what's opinion. You know, I would think brain tissue, it's a fact. It's, you cannot refute it, but it seems to be refutable. Someone's an expert, and I assume he's not lying, you know, can have a different opinion to what you can have. How can that be? It doesn't make sense to me.
No, that's right. I think I had mentioned to you previously that one of the problems with the human brain is I don't think it's fit for purpose. I don't think it's designed to be absolutely logical on all occasions. And we see this in pathology. You get what we call inter-observer variation. In other words, this pathologist sees and interprets it one way, and this pathologist sees and interprets it another way. Now, it shouldn't be like that. We should be able to agree on what we see and agree on what the answer is. It isn't always like that. Generally it is. Generally we do agree. But you can get inter-observer variation. But more compellingly, you can get intra-observer variation. In other words, on Monday I think this, but on Friday I think that. And our brains are wired in this way. They are not totally logical and consistent. And they're not fit for purpose. We certainly shouldn't be flying aeroplanes. It's a very dangerous thing to do.
So like you were saying this morning, the sooner people are out of this role, the better.
The sooner we hand over to, we should outsource everything to AI and just sit back and enjoy the scenery. We'll all be much happier.
So what was the whole Privy Council experience like? You said it was an amazing experience.
I think the level of the caliber of judge was extremely high.
Right.
The questions they asked were very perceptive and pertinent, and you could see exactly what they were getting at. And you know what? The more I think about it, the more I think that what I'm thinking were brilliant legal judgments. It was just common sense.
Mm.
They were just applying common sense. They weren't saying, "Oh, I'm a judge and I think this and that." And
but they can see through all the rubbish.
They could see all of that
to come to the common sense conclusion.
Yeah,
which so many people can't do.
And like that, another example with Lord Hughes that I thought was very pertinent was this issue of the gastric emptying and the time of death. Now, this arose because James Pang had said that the victims had undigested food, and it was known that they had had a McDonald's meal at 5:30 in the evening. So it was presumed that within 1 hour from 5:30 they'd been murdered. And this required Mark Lundy to have driven at breakneck speed through the rush hour traffic from the hut to Palmerston North. Possible, but difficult. And Lord Hughes said, "I'm not sure why the Crown is so intent on proving when the murder occurred. It's irrelevant, surely. If you prove that Mr. Lundy did the murder, then it doesn't matter when he did it. He could have done it before he was with the prostitute at night or afterwards. Why are you intent on proving it? It's not relevant." And in the third trial, that's exactly what they said. They said, "We don't know when they were murdered. It was sometime between that evening and the next morning."
The whole case changed, didn't it?
They changed the case, and it was all based on what Lord Hughes said to them. And that's common sense. You don't have to prove when it happened. If it happened, and Lord Hughes said, and I put it to you, the cardinal point is the brain tissue on the shirt.
Change of tack.
Okay.
Accidents.
Accidents, yeah.
You've said you enjoy the challenge of air accidents.
Yes.
You've said you've always volunteered for them. You have a PPL and you used to fly around the country a lot.
Yeah.
So there's an interest there, obviously. But on the other hand, you wrote this about how you felt after receiving a phone call about a car accident. I think it was a car accident. You were in bed, I think, when you received the call. You said, "After that, I lay tautly awake, knowing I had to scrape together sufficient courage to meet the horror of the task ahead. It was always the same at the start of any accident case. The waiting beforehand was the worst part. I've sometimes wondered if there's such a thing as pre-traumatic stress disorder."
Yes, yeah.
What is it about accidents that are so tough? Or for you anyway, I'm sure they are for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's the finality of death that's so unexpected. And I remember when I first came to New Zealand, I think it must have been about the second autopsy I did, was on a man from Levin. And what had happened was he wanted to buy a car. And he'd gone to a second-hand car dealer and found a car there. And he and the car dealer took it out for a test drive. And it was late evening. It was winter. It was getting dark. It was probably about 5:30 in the evening. And they drove north out of Levin towards Foxton on State Highway 1. And they saw some cattle that got on the road. So he pulled over and went to move them off. And a car came out of the mist and killed him. And that really shocked me. Not his injuries were shocking, But the fact that here's a man who went to buy a car and his family are sitting at home in front of the television, excited because dad's gone to buy a car and he's dead in my mortuary.
Mm.
You know, I just find that I go through that this is horrible sort of feeling whenever I first come across an accident. I think it's that. It's the
So it's not so much the devastation and the destruction of human. It's not that.
No.
That's what I thought you were going to say.
No. It's the impact, the sort of the sadness, if you like, of a life cut off there.
Mm.
You know, sometimes I look at these people and I think, like I've seen a case where a family were killed, the mother and father were killed, and I think, who's going to look after the children? They're coming home from holiday. What about the cat and the dog in the, you know, that they've put in the cattery? Or who's going to do, what happens to them?
Mm.
I still don't know what happens to them.
And I think you mentioned that whenever you go on holiday, it crosses your mind.
Yeah.
Have I got things sorted in case something happens?
Well, you think, yeah, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
You know, who comes and packs up your stuff, and you know, what about my books, and you know, what happens to them? Where do my clothes go? Well, I know where they go. They go to the hospice, I suppose, or to one of the op shops. All my clothes come from op shops. Shelley's a great op shop buyer, and every single one of my clothes comes from an op shop. And I always say, well,
op shops by the look of it.
Yeah, no, she's very good at it. But I always say, well, it's appropriate that I wear dead men's clothes. They're not all from the hospice, of course.
You mentioned a Piper Seneca crash in 1988.
Yeah.
And it's sort of hard for me to comprehend the level of destruction and carnage that obviously happened there.
Yeah, that was a heavily overladen. I think they had 8 or 9 passengers, or 2 or 3 of them were children, which was terrible. But also a passenger had come up very late and persuaded them to give him a seat, and somehow they got him in, and they were ramming suitcases into the lockers, and so I suspect his weight balance was probably out, and it was terrible weather, and I suspect that he had throttled back. I'm not sure, because he had his undercarriage lowered, which was strange. And he was a long way from he wasn't on finals or anything like that. He was a long way out, and I suspect he had throttled back because of the turbulence, and I think he just went into a spin, because it was clearly an aircraft going in that sort of situation.
But the destruction of human body.
Yeah, one of the propellers had gone through the cabin, and the 6 or 7 people in the front of the cabin, it had gone through them, and the 2 or 3 in the back, it had missed them. So there was a difference in injury pattern between the various victims, and of course we had to put them all together and decide who was who and so on. It was interesting. You get feedback after writing the books. A woman came to me and said my sister was one of the passengers on board, and it turned out that her sister was, if you read the story, there was a baby, she had a baby on board, and we couldn't find the baby. We'd found all the victims, we couldn't find her, and eventually I found the baby inside her, that the impact had driven the baby back into her abdominal cavity, and I found the baby in there, and you know, that's what it was. And I thought, well, the baby was on her lap, and she came to me and she said, that was my sister, and you don't know how grateful we are that you have told us that, because my mother always said, I just hoped she was holding the baby when the plane went in. And she said, clearly she was. And she said, that's given us so much comfort. And she said, I also want to thank you for the work that you've done, that you did in putting them together again. She said, when they went to the funeral, the coffin was in the front of the church, and her mother broke down and said, I can't do this because I don't know that she's in there. they were so mixed up. I don't know who it is. I have to see her. And the undertaker opened the coffin and brought out some hair. And she looked at it and said, "That's my daughter's hair."
Wow.
And that's all she wanted.
Mm.
And she said, "Thank you so much for getting it right." And I think we spent 2 or 3 days getting it absolutely right. Because it is important.
Absolutely. And it must be such a nice feeling to get that feedback from family, that it means so much to them.
Yeah.
A nice feeling for you.
Yeah, I thought, well, you say, why do you do this? How can you do it? There's a reason why we do it. It is important for people. And their story is important too. Interestingly, they never knew the story we'd had a coroner's court. They never knew the story before my book came out.
Which is hard to believe, isn't it? You would think this would all come out.
Yeah. And that's been a very common experience. A lot of people have said, "Thank you so much for coming and telling us this. We didn't know any of this." And I think that in years gone by, the coroners sort of sat majestically in the law there and made their findings. And I don't think the story was passed on. And I don't think pathologists, quite frankly, were very good at it either.
No. Hopefully we're better at it now.
Hopefully, yeah.
You don't sound convinced.
No.
Another one which you were part of was the Ansett -8 crash.
Oh, yes.
Which must have been scary when you heard the news. But the thing that was of interest to me is your discussion about destiny and the person in seat 7A versus 7B.
Yeah.
I think that was
I find that extraordinary. There, very little things sit between us and death. Every day, every minute of every day, a coin is spinning above us, and you don't know whether it's going to land heads or tails. And I always say to people, I sit here talking to you, but you don't know whether on Monday you're going to be in my mortuary. I don't know whether I'm going to be in my mortuary. None of us know this. Destiny is waiting for us. And that was extraordinary in that -8 accident. They were sitting right next to where the wing root ripped off. And the person sitting next to the window had a minor injury, broken ankle, and the person next to them had massive injuries, such as you would expect from a high-speed motorcycle accident. What was the difference between them? 7A and 7B. It depends when you got to the ticket counter.
Unbelievable.
Where did you park? Did you stop for an extra cup of coffee? That decides whether you're going to live or you're going to die. And interestingly enough, a few weeks ago, one of the physicians came rushing in here and he said, "You're not going to believe this." He said, "I've just flown back from Auckland and the man sitting next to me was reading your book and the final diagnosis." And I started talking to him. And we started talking about the Ansett thing in 7A. And he said, "Guess what seats we were sitting in?" We were in 7A and 7B.
No.
He said, "What are the chances of that?"
I bet one of them was trying to swap. Yeah, it's a bit of a scary thought.
Now, I've always found the aviation ones really interesting. I mean, they're a challenge from a pathology perspective. And of course, there's often not very much that you can say about the pilots too. We have to look at quite carefully, of course, for sudden incapacitation. But I've always found that all the circumstances are always interesting. I mean, as a former pilot, I'm interested in them. And, pilots don't crash airplanes knowingly. You're the first to arrive on the scene if you do. So it's usually a catalogue of errors, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The balance between the connection to the person who was once alive and remaining unattached must be tough for you. And there was one story in your book where you were doing an autopsy on a young lad and you said to him, "What's happened to you here, my young fellow?" So you obviously, don't know if you see them as still alive, but you treat them as a living person, something in terms of the care you provide for them.
Yeah, people, I think, might think that pathologists are a bit like a butcher's shop, but I see them as my patients. You know, I'm doing a medical procedure on them with a view to being their last advocate and telling their story because they can't. And it's important that their story be told. And in that sense, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about I always put myself in the mind of the person lying there. What were you doing? What were you thinking? Why did you do this? And does it actually make sense? Does it pass the sniff test? Does this look all right? Or did something happen that nobody's saying?
What about when it's someone you know on the table? How does that feel?
Just the same. I have done autopsies on 3 or 4 occasions now on friends of mine. And Guy Lawton was one who crashed his, I think it was a Baron at Fielding with his 2 sons on board. He had an engine failure at night. And instead of landing at Palmerston, he flew to Fielding, which was an uncontrolled field. And he landed downwind and realized that he had a mistake. So he went around, but he turned around the dead engine and stalled and went in. I did the autopsy on him and his sons, and I've done it, but I regard doing it on my friends, it's an honor. I'm their physician. I'm looking after them. I'm telling their story. You know, the fact that I know them is difficult, but that's my job.
When I interviewed Dave Baldwin, he was talking about his son, his and Sandy's son, Mark, who took his life, and he said that it felt so good to him to be giving him to you because he knew someone was going to take care of him.
Yeah, no, that's right. And certainly when I looked after Mark, I asked him why he did this. I do talk to the dead, in my mind anyway.
Yeah.
And they answer. You get the feeling.
What's it like? Sorry, I'm dancing between subjects here. What's it like looking at a brain or holding a brain? And the reason I ask this is because, again, something you wrote about a brain. Below was the glistening, transparent pia mater.
Pia mater, yeah.
Pia mater, Latin for the tender mother, delicately covering the mysterious moist hills and valley of the convoluted sulci and gyri of the brain, wherein lies embedded everything from our intelligence to our humanity, our piano lessons, our childhood memories, our very souls. Which is a crazy concept that you have that in your hand. And an hour or two ago, that was
everything that you were.
All alive. Everything that person was is ticking away, and now it's not there anymore. Do you think about that when you're doing that?
I do all the time. I mean, if you imagine holding a brain there and you think, this brain was fluent in French and can do calculus.
Yeah.
And now I've got it in my hand and it can do nothing. This is really weird. And this is where you get into the whole thought of what are we and what is the soul and, you know, where do we come from? I don't know the answers to this. I find it really quite fascinating.
Yeah.
But yeah, when I look at a brain, I think this is just amazing.
Must be an incredible feeling to be holding that capability in your hand.
Yeah, and it's gone. Well, I suppose a computer's the same. And you carry your laptop down to the car, do you?
Yeah, but a brain's different, isn't it? I mean, brain has emotions and love and hate, and there's so much more to it, I think.
Yeah, the complexity and the irregularity, or the point of it is so strange.
No, I just found that an interesting concept. You mention the soul, or at least, you know, what's more to us, and I think you said this is another subject that everyone wants to know about because we don't know. There's obviously no physical organ which you can cut out of someone called a soul, but you talked about a scientific study done by someone in the early 1900s, which I found really interesting.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about what that was?
This is Dr. Duncan McDougall from Massachusetts, and he had a theory that the soul had weight.
This was
I think 1901.
Yeah.
Or 1901, 1902. And he was a very prominent, a well-respected, highly respected physician. And he was physician in a TB hospital where about 25% of the people who went there could expect to die. And he, together with a group of other doctors, decided to investigate whether the soul did have weight. They got a very accurate industrial scale called a Fairbanks scale, which I've looked up, and it's accurate down to a fraction of an ounce. And it was they built a framework on it to hold a bed, and that was all then set at neutral. And a patient was anybody who volunteered for this was set on this. And when their time came to die, they'd put them on this bed, and they would sit around with the weight, with the scale weighing exactly what the patient weight was. And they would all sit there, sometimes for 2 or 3 hours, until the patient died. And they did this in 4 cases. And in each of the cases, they recorded a loss of weight at the instant of death, not after time, immediately. And the change of weight was variable, but the one that sort of caught imagination was 3/4 of an ounce or 21 grams. And they attributed this loss of weight due to the soul departing the body. And by way of an experiment, he then euthanized 15 dogs and showed no change in weight at the time of death, which he thought was reasonable because dogs didn't have a soul. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it was a very interesting study, and it's never been repeated. It was refuted angrily by many scientists.
I bet it was.
None of whom had any reason to say why it was wrong. I mean, one scientist said it's wrong because when you die, all the heat comes out of your armpits, and the heat goes, and the sweat evaporates off there, which is absolute rubbish.
And that wouldn't happen instantly, even.
It doesn't happen. It's not true. But that was one of the leading scientists of the day said no. That's why. Anyway, it's never been refuted, and my argument has always been that's not the scientific way. If somebody makes an observation, another group must repeat it, and if the observation is made repeatedly and found to be true, then you develop a theory why it's happening, and look into that. And that's never happened. So all we've got is the fact that he did it, and he did find a drop, and he thinks it's due to the soul. I don't know whether that's right or wrong, but I find that quite intriguing, because if it is true, and there is a soul, and it does weigh 21 grams, what does that mean for society and for churchgoers and so on? I don't know. And as I've said, it's sort of a bit tongue-in-cheek. Does that mean an atheist has got no weight in his soul?
Or it's just gone to a different place, maybe.
Yeah. Does a Jew have the same weight as a Christian? Who knows?
I think it's better we don't find the answer to this.
This could become a new form of discrimination.
Yeah.
The weight of your soul.
Yeah, that's right. I've got a few last questions for you. You talk about how we've sanitized death in our Western society, and it was interesting to hear about African culture. But, it seems to me that we don't see the dead body for a very long period at all. And as you say, we use words like pass away or go to sleep. We're scared to talk about dying and death. Do you think how we treat death is healthy? Do you think there's a better way we could do it? Or it's just our culture and it's not good or bad?
Yeah, I don't know.
And the reason I ask is that I sort of feel that it would be much better for the grieving process if we were around the body more, if we could somehow feel more open about touching the body and being with it out in the open. I just feel that would be better, but it's not what we do. I know when my dad died during COVID, he died in the early hours of the morning, and the undertaker was there first thing, whisked him away, and
that's the way it goes.
We saw him very briefly again, but
yep, no, that's the way it goes. And as you say, it's completely sanitized. Is it healthy? I guess it is what it is. Would it be healthier to be more open? I suspect it would be. I don't think it'll take away the fascination with death or our macabre interest in it. Culturally, our Christian or Judeo-Christian basis, the early Christians used to bury their dead for a year or 18 months, and then they would dig them up again and to see if the flesh had all gone. And the idea was that if the person was free of sin, then the flesh would be received well into the earth and the bare bones would remain. And those bones could then be buried in hallowed ground. And that's the origin of all the ossuaries that they have all over Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Because what they'd do is they'd take the skeletons, they'd put all the skulls in one pile and all the femurs in another, and all the tibias, and I've seen them. And I said, I don't understand why have they done this? And this was the reason. So those are all the people who were received well. If you dig them up and there's still flesh there, then they'd done evil. And then they were buried, but not in hallowed ground, not in the church. They'd be buried outside.
And they're forever scorned.
And therefore forever scorned. And, I think even when I was young, I remember hearing suicides, you're not allowed to bury them in a cemetery. They have to be buried somewhere else. And that was the rule in those days. The priests wouldn't allow suicides to be buried in a cemetery, but that's all changed now, of course. So the early Christians had a very intimate relationship with their dead. I mean, I'm not sure I'd like to go and dig up my parents to see if they had a good life or not. But
no. What about? Forgive me if this is a bit personal, but you've dealt with thousands of dead bodies. Would you treat the death of, say, a close family member, or would you want to, any different to the rest of us? In terms of what we're talking about, having the body around more, or would you be happy with the undertaker whisking one of your family members away as soon as possible? Would that feel a bit strange to you? Or?
No, I probably I'd go for the more traditional approach of getting them away and getting everything tidied up.
Wow.
But that's probably just my upbringing. I'd feel a bit uneasy sitting next to a close relative who is dead. I don't know why.
It's interesting to me, that answer. I thought you were going to say, no, I'd like to be with them because you're so used to being around.
I am, yeah. I think I'd just feel uneasy. It's hard to define why, isn't it? As you say, that brain that I hold in my hand has got some peculiar connections in it. We don't understand them all, do we?
No. A statement you wrote in your book: no one knows when or if they have an appointment in the mortuary, but they very well may end up keeping one. Nothing's surer than dying. Only the timing and manner of death is unknown. Perhaps humans are fortunate that our own individual deaths are so unimaginable to us. Maybe that's what allows us to carry on. And when I read that, I wondered if your death is as unimaginable to you as it is to the rest of us. Because the reason I ask this is sometimes I think, those of us that have slightly interesting or different careers or professions, we get very used to it. So I'm a pilot, and you get very used to being up in the air, but to other people it's something different and amazing. Or a brain surgeon is very used to chopping open a brain, but I'd be terrified to go and have brain surgery. And you're very used to dealing with thousands of dead bodies, but does that make you more immune to thinking about your own death?
I think it does, because I do think about it a bit. I won't say I'm macabre about it or spend a lot of time, but I do imagine it, and yeah, I think it. I'm interested. I would really like to know, but unfortunately, it's one of the things that I won't know.
No. But you don't find it
I don't find it
terrifying
frightening.
or frightening?
I'm not frightened of death. No, I'm not frightened of the dead, of death, or anything like that. I'll go into any graveyard at midnight. It doesn't worry me.
One last question. When are you going to retire? Dave Baldwin says he's never going to retire. I think I've read that you said the same thing.
Yeah.
And how would you fill your time? But from seeing you this morning with a 2-year-old and a 6-week-old, I think I know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I think young children certainly keep the old man out, don't they? No, I love the work, and I love coming to work, and as long as I can keep going, I will. Pathologists are quite lucky in a sense, because all you have to retain is your cognitive ability. There are no weekend calls or after-hour calls, particularly if you've got forensic pathologists doing all the suspicious work. So it's just the diagnostic work. My friend James Pang was telling me that he went on a cruise to the United States, and he said there was a pathologist on board there who'd just retired, and he was 76 years old. And his father was over 100 years old, and he was also a pathologist. And he said it's very embarrassing. He's still working. He said he still goes in a couple of days a week. And he said, now I've retired. He said, I held off for a long time because I thought I can't retire before my father. And I think pathologists can do that. You know, we're basically, what am I doing? I'm like a person who loves crosswords or Sudoku, and you just spend your life doing that. You know, what could be better?
I guess I do have another question, just talking about your young children. Nothing to do with pathology, but what's it like being a second-time dad? I think you're in your 70s, is that right?
Yeah.
Do you treat it any different to your first lot of kids?
Yes, I think so. You know, I think when you're young and you have children, you're building up a business and you focused elsewhere to a large extent. And, you know, my first 3 children, I was flying a lot. I was building up the business. I was investigating murders and doing all of these things. You know, life was very full and everything. Whereas when you're older, it's more like a grandparent. You know, you're really I'm fascinated by the reading, and I'm fascinated by spending time in the play and so on. So I think there's a lot more of that when you're older. That's been my experience anyway. It is quite different. And some things have changed. I mean, we used to have cloth nappies that you pinned on with a safety pin, but now they're all Velcro, and it seems a lot easier than it used to be.
Yeah, and you don't have to thumb all the shit down the sink anymore like we did when we had kids too.
No, it's changed. It's changed. It's a lot easier in many ways, yeah.
But I have to say, not that I'm thinking of it, but it looked very nice when I walked in this morning and you had a 6-week-old on your shoulder. It was lovely.
Yeah. No.
Anyway, thanks very much for your time,
Thank
Cynric.
you.
I really appreciate it, and being shown around. It was cool to see. So
good. Thank you very much. Very interesting talk, and good luck. Well, it's Saturday morning, so everything looks very quiet here, but there are usually 15 or 20 people in here sorting out specimens, and the specimens arrive in this area from all around the country. They come from Wanganui, from Gisborne, and they all get processed here and directed to the correct departments.
Are there other labs in the country?
Yes, we've got one in Wanganui and we've got one in Gisborne, both in the public hospitals there. So we run the public hospitals in each of those places, as well as providing all the services for the GPs and the midwives and the various other allied medical groups for all of those areas. So we cover, as well as that, we have the regional cancer treatment service here in Palmerston North. So overall, we cover about 360,000 New Zealanders. We do provide all of their pathology services. And for those who are unfortunate enough to pass away, we have a mortuary downstairs where we provide the autopsy service for those who are going to require it.
So this doesn't include blood testing?
Yes, this does. This is all blood testing. Right. You'll see that as we go through. So the specimens get sorted, and technology is now taking over. They all all the specimens get thrown into a big bucket, and they get put into this machine, which automatically sorts them into where they have to go. In the old days, people used to sit there and look at it and look at the form and say, oh, I need a serum iron or a ferritin or thyroid function test. That goes there and that goes there. Now it's all done automatically. So
how does it know?
It's got their barcodes that are on each specimen, and each specimen is logged into a computer with all the tests that are needed. And then they get brought through and logged and put on the testing machines, which are these. Now, in the old days, you had benches and burettes and pipettes and glassware and people pipetting and so on. And now everybody's heard of AI. These machines use AI. They can do everything. They know exactly what tests are needed on each patient. The tests are all done automatically. If they're all within normal limits and don't need to be looked at by a scientist or a pathologist, they automatically get reported electronically directly to the GP. And of course, one of the things that people don't realize, you can see this instrument here, there's an identical one there. Every laboratory has to have two because we run ICUs. You can't have downtime. We run emergency departments. So if one goes down, the others flicks in.
But every individual test how's it actually analysed? It's not visually, it's putting another substance to react with.
Yes, and then it's measured in the instrument. They can be a colour test, or there are a whole variety of different chemical reactions that go on. So your blood that comes in here, on you they want to know what's your blood serum iron, what's your thyroid function test, what are your liver function tests. Specifically, it will look at that specimen and say, oh, that's you, this is your doctor, these are the tests you want, here they are, yeah, they're all normal, wham, gone. Unseen by human hands. Now this area in here is where all the PCR testing is done.
Right.
PCR testing is the way that COVID is diagnosed.
So this was not here pre-COVID?
This was not here at all. This was, I can't remember what it was. It was an unused part of the lab. And during COVID, we had to build this as we were doing testing. So we borrowed a laboratory up at, we borrowed a lab up at Massey and used that while we were building this, and then moved in here. And now it's operational all the time. Not only doing COVID testing, but doing DNA testing for all sorts of other viruses. You know, in the old days, they thought you had meningitis. They'd take a lumbar puncture and you'd get the fluid and you'd have to look at it under the microscope and culture it and so on. Now we bang it in there, and in an hour it will have surveyed for, I think, 7 or 8 different types of bacteria and about 12 different types of virus, and it's all there and done. So everything is changing all the time.
So rapid, isn't it?
It's just brilliant, it really is. So they're working all the time. Now this is the hematology department. Again, it looks very quiet, but that's because the machines are doing a lot of the work. And when you have a full blood count taken, it gets put into this machine that checks out everything. Everything's normal, out goes the result. Abnormal goes to a scientist. Scientist knows what it is, puts it out. Scientist doesn't know what it is, takes it to a pathologist. And
you're the last step in the line.
Where the pathologist, well, the hematologists are. I'm a different sort of pathologist.
It's interesting how if the computer doesn't know what it is, it goes to a person. Is there going to be a time where the computers are just way smarter and the computer will be the last line?
I hope so.
You hope so?
Yeah, well, as I've got older in life, I've found out that the human brain is actually not fit for purpose. It doesn't work very well. Fools you all the time. And that's why pilots fly airplanes into mountains, of course, because they see what they want to see rather than what's actually there. And computers, I don't think, do that. So I think the time will come when we'll get there. And the big thing is to not let humans touch anything.
Especially as technology gets so advanced. I mean, how can one person be trained to know?
Right, that's right. Yeah. This is microbiology, which is where swabs
G'day.
and hi Tina, swabs and bacteria are grown, and this is what the lab used to look like. Benches like this and divides between them, and scientists working at benches. Alexander Fleming, who was the discoverer of penicillin, would have recognized everything in this laboratory. The culture plates are all here with the organisms growing in them. Have you got a nice bug to show us? Tina, this is Craig, who's doing a thing on laboratories.
Thank you with my left hand.
Yeah, nice to meet you. So this is Staph aureus.
Okay.
Okay, so Staph aureus can be commensal on the skin, but it can also be pathogenic, and it can produce very nasty toxins as well. So it's one of those organisms that in some places it's considered just normal, and in other places it's very pathogenic and needs treating.
Right.
And then what we do is
So you've cultured that from a tiny sample, or
we've cultured that from a swab.
yeah,
So the doctor's taken a swab of a wound,
yeah.
and we've cultured it.
And how long would it take to get it to this point?
24 hours, well, about 17 hours to get to that point.
Mm.
And then, but straight behind you, we've got what we call the MS, which is a laser. Inside that cabinet, we've got a laser. And what we do is we get one of these slides, and we colour in literally with we take some of the bug and just colour in the circle, put a matrix on there, put it into the machine. The laser fires on it 100 times, and the profile that it gets out of the ribosomal DNA it then works it through its database and will match and then tell us what the organism identification is.
Wow.
So you can get an ID in less than 15 seconds.
Wow, it's amazing, isn't it?
In the old days that like TC was talking about, we would have to put up sugars and identification panels, and they could take 24 to 48 hours.
That goes back a bit, doesn't it? Yeah.
And that would be assessed manually by a person.
Yes.
It's such a thing that no one knows about. You just get a swab, and then you get your answer a day later. And but this
the complexity behind it is actually huge, and people come through labs, they can't believe it.
Yeah.
They had no idea this happened. They thought, a doctor does something in the room, takes him 30 seconds, and it's all done.
But when you think of the number of samples, blood, urine, swabs, and the number of people, I mean, it's massive, isn't it?
Yeah, it is massive.
So this is the mortuary. One of the things that you can't get a feel for on film is there's a slight aroma to it. I don't know if you can detect it.
It's nothing like I was imagining it might be. I sort of thought it might be an off-putting smell, but if anything, it's a little bit sweet.
Yes, it can be a bit off-putting if somebody's been in the river for 3 weeks, but today is not like that. Once the coroners came down here, and they stood down here, and one of them was looking a bit uneasy, and he said, "What's that funny smell?" And I said, "Well, that's the smell of death." And he said, "Really? Is that here all the time?" And I said, "Yeah, it's here all the time. There've been hundreds of bodies have come through."
It's interesting that a coroner doesn't know that smell.
Yeah, well, of course, they're lawyers, so their view is a bit different. These are the fridges. We have 19 of those. This one we've had to modify so that we can take bariatric patients, the oversized patients, because these are very old fridges, and they were built at a time when your average weight was probably something like 65 or 70 kilograms. And now we've had up to 200 kilograms, and they just don't fit in the smaller fridges. So this has been specially built to take larger patients. So they get kept in here and either picked up by the funeral directors or held here until they've had their autopsy and then delivered back home. Now, we do the autopsies here for Hawke's Bay, for Wanganui, for, of course, the whole of the Manawatu, Tararuas, right down to Masterton. They all come in here. So we do about 350, probably one a day, but more than one a working day here, which is a pretty hefty load. Right, let's go through and have a look at where the work's done. This is the scale on which the bodies are measured, weighed, sorry. The bodies are, of course, on a gurney, and the gurney's been pre-weighed, and this has been set at, 119 kilograms, which is probably the weight of the gurney up here. So they wheel the body in, and then it'll tell you give you exactly what your weight is. Now,
what's the significance of the weight, other than just a number? Is there a significance in terms of the task?
Yes, we do weight and height, and that enables you to look at things like body mass index, and it goes to the whole holistic picture of who was this person, what were all their parameters, what were their risk factors, and this sort of thing. Because, of course, the death may be not suspicious, it may be unexpected. And, of course, if the person's substantially overweight and has a very high body BMI, body mass index, then their risk factors for diabetes, for heart disease and so on are substantially higher. And you might be interested in this. These are the sheets that the pathologists. These are the sheets that the pathologists take in on a clipboard, to make notes of what they see there. But of course, we photograph everything as well.
Yeah.
So every autopsy's got a photographic record as well as these diagrams.
Are they videoed? Do you have a video camera set up?
No.
Almost like an aircraft cockpit voice recorder or something?
No, we don't. We haven't done that. I mean, you could do that too.
Mm.
Okay, all quiet in here. So this is the mortuary where it all happens. These are the tables on which the deceased get placed, and the evisceration, the removal of the organs, occurs there. And then they are brought across to the cut-up benches where the pathologists work. If medical students, doctors, or the police want to watch, they go behind that screen up there, and they can watch the whole process. These tables are hydraulic. You put the bodies on them, they go up and down, and our mortuary assistants are very good at getting bodies which are a dead weight on and off here. And sometimes, as I've said, they're very, very heavy.
I see just down the corridor there's some full-on masks and respirators. Yeah. What's that for? Is that for if there's a particularly nasty...
Yeah. It's one of the health and safety things that's come in. I mean, back in the day, I remember when pathologists used to have their clothes and they'd put an apron over them and pull on some gardening gloves and do their autopsy. I mean, I won't say they were eating their sandwiches at the same time, but it has been rumoured. Some of them used to smoke while they were doing autopsies. Mm. And then it's gradually changed. I mean, I belong to the generation of pathologists where we put on scrubs and we gowned up. But I've never used a face mask. But these days they often wear face masks because of the dangers of tuberculosis and the dangers of mad cow disease, Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, and a whole variety of things that I guess we just took it as that was part of our profession.
And how often do you get people coming in to watch, police officers or other people who just can't take it and either end up being sick or have to run out? Or
yeah, it doesn't happen very often. The police are pretty clued up with it. They're used to it. Yeah, probably the young doctors would be the most vulnerable. Yeah. And in my day, medical students and doctors were very familiar with autopsies. We went to lots of them. These days, I've got registrars working for me who've been a couple of years in the hospital and never seen an autopsy. You can get through medical school without ever seeing one, which to me seems bizarre, but that's the way of it these days. Everything has changed.
I'm quite pleased. I was a little bit concerned that I might do a Paul Holmes and keel over just being in here, but I feel no.
I'll tell you what got him. Let's see if I can find one. Yeah, here we are. Yeah, he said, "What do you cut the body up with?" So I said, "It's one of these," and then he had to go and sit down. I don't know why. It's just the thought of it.
Be a nice fish filleting knife.
Yeah, no, they're very sharp. Pat, our mortuary assistant, grinds them and keeps them really sharp for us.
And you talk in your books about the rib cutters, the scissors for cutting the ribs.
Yeah, here they are. Here, we just get those from Bunnings.
Really?
Yeah. Again, you can get them from the catalogue, and they're probably $10,000 each. We just get these from Bunnings.
Brutal.
Yeah.
I suppose they do exactly the same.
Well, they do exactly the same job. I mean, it's, in Africa we used to have a saying that a tap doesn't have to be gold to carry water. A brass one will do it just the same.
Very true. And so you have mortuary assistants as well that do a lot of the...
They do most of it. They move the bodies in and out of the fridges. They open them up and remove the organs, and they replace them all, and they stitch them up, and they do it all beautifully.
You speak very highly of.
They are. I just can't speak highly enough of them. They are really brilliant at it. And, again, you've got to find the right sort of person for it, because it's, you get children, you get people who've been run over by trains, you get sad suicides. There's a lot of stuff there that you've got to deal with. I've always found that the volunteer firemen are a great group to hire.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Oh, as mortuary assistants.
As mortuary assistants, you bring them on. Same sort of group, they've been to
But the job those guys do.
It's unbelievable, yeah.
Incredible.
Well, Pat, our head of the mortuary, he was a volunteer fireman. We've had a couple over the years, and they're good. The other attribute that I would look for is the ability to use black humour, because I think that defuses things. The police certainly do it, the firemen do it, and the mortuary assistants do too.
Yeah, and I think probably if some members of the public hear that, they would see that as being disrespectful. But for you guys that are here doing it every day, I mean, you're just people,
Yeah.
You just need to break it up somehow.
It just relieves the pressure slightly, and it's not, as you say, it's not disrespectful to the patients. It's we regard them as our patients. They're people we have to look after. But sometimes you just you have to do it. The police are very good. I love their humour too. They get it.
Yeah, yeah.
Probably do.
Roll up the sleeves.
Normally you gown up in here too, and some of them wear masks and so on. I did my medical training in Rhodesia, and in our hospital we had hundreds of patients with open tuberculosis, patients with rabies, patients with meningitis, and one of the things they said, if you're going to do medicine, it's a risk factor. That's your profession. You just deal with it. Your immune system has to deal with it. But these days, of course, we're much more health and safety orientated.
How often do you actually get your hands dirty or involved in this stuff these days, or is it
in this cut-up? No, we have scientists who do it.
Personally?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I very rarely now. If I have to do something, it's usually because there's a problem. I do all the autopsies, all the hospital-based medical interest autopsies, because the forensic people don't want to do those. Right, so this is where the cut-up is done, and basically biopsies, like a breast biopsy or a liver biopsy, all come here and they get processed and turned into slides for the pathologist to look at. Once the diagnosis has been made, of course, the patients will then go for operation. And I'm just trying to find one that is... Yeah, there we are. This will probably do. That'll be a bit better than this one. They then have the organ removed. So here we have a patient who has a kidney. here we have, this is the surgeon has removed this kidney. I'm not sure what the reason is. There may be a tumour in there. I don't see one at the moment, and I haven't got the history in front of me. But our scientists have marked the outside with ink, so that if there is a cancer, they can tell whether it goes to the margin or not. We can tell when we look at the slide, because the ink will be on the slide. They've then cut it in half to let the formalin in to fix it, so that the tissues are all permanently...
Fixing means preserving.
Preserving, yeah. And that's what this is doing. So this is waiting for them to look at on Monday, and they will then take sections from that, and we'll make the diagnosis. I'm not quite sure what we're looking at there. So that's a kidney. And
does the formalin, it's almost inert in terms of the tissue that you're studying. It obviously has no effect.
It just fixes the proteins. Yeah. It turns it's like pickling. Pickling.
But it changes nothing in terms of the tissues.
No. You get a bit of shrinkage and that's it. But otherwise you can't see that. You don't see any effect. Here's the clinical history. Left renal tumour, query chromophobe. Well, I didn't see a tumour in there, so we'll have to see. These are the histological slides waiting to go across to be reported by the pathologists. So this is what
these are
tissue. That's a piece of tissue that's been taken from one of those specimens. It's been fixed, it's been put in a block, and a wax block, and a section cut, and it's been stained.
So is it cut manually or by a machine?
Manually.
How thin are they?
The ladies over there do it. They're about 4 to 5 microns.
Wow, and it's cut with an actual...
A blade.
Or a
blade. A blade, yeah. Come on, I'll show you one. There we are. This is the machine. I'm not sure that there's a blade in there.
The whole organ in there, and or a piece of it. And
a little wax block gets put in there. I'll show you that. Yeah, there. There's a wax block. The tissue that we've taken is embedded in the wax block, and then they cut it off the top of that.
Right.
A very thin section. So if you get something that you're interested in, the next section along is the next bit, and you can do special tests on that and discover more about what the disease process is. And they all get cut on these. These are manual knives. They're rotary. They're very good at doing this. As you can see, that they make thousands and thousands of them.
Yeah.